Hello, everyone, and welcome to Through Time and Clades. My name is Joan,
And I'm Albert.
and welcome back to our series Humanity a Prologue. We're now on episode 9, Around the World. But before we jump into our usually scheduled program, Albert, how are you doing?
I've been all right. It's been a real whirlwind week for me. Just busy with a lot of different things, but yeah, not too much major to report. I'm still kind of hanging in there, as it were.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, it's certainly been a week for me. Not the best week, but
Mm, mm,
uh, things are getting a little bit better.
that's good to hear.
Thankfully, the time that I've spent working on this show and just getting my usual rest has kind of helped me keep my mind at ease.
Mm.
Um, so, yeah, certainly like even better days are upon us.
Right. Yeah. Totally.
I mean, spring is here,
That is true.
and I'm certainly feeling it. It's been lovely days lately.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the story of the expansion of Homo sapiens to the other continents is one that has been told and retold countless times. It's the incredible human journey out of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Popularized in books and media for lay people and specialists alike. Um, the way that's usually been told, however, is very grossly oversimplified.
Mm.
Simple suites of hunter gatherers wandering across varied terrain to reach these key destinations, which are treated as milestones on a checklist,
Right.
given basic dates, and then, depending on where recorded human events occur, are either given high narrative prominence or just kind of abandoned as historical backwaters, only to be treated when colonial powers emerge and
Mm.
need a stage to assert themselves.
Right.
Um, so, as is customary in this series, we're going to look at what the evidence actually says. Fields like archaeology and genetics have revealed that the story of the sapiens population expansions is more complex and less clearly understood than conventional narratives will tell you. Many sites have been redated. Disparate peoples across the world have been found to be linked by forgotten history, and a number of controversies have emerged. We've given a brief summary of paleoanthropological research in Eurasia, from Chinese stone tools over 2 million years old to the last populations of Neanderthals facing a demographic crisis roughly 40,000 years ago. And now it's time to turn the story on our own species and see how we've adapted ourselves and our environments far beyond our ancestral homeland of Africa.
Mm.
So this is going to be one big road trip,
Yeah.
So
Totally.
buckle up, make sure you got your snacks and your drinks, and if you haven't gone to the bathroom, please make sure you do so because
Right.
we're only going to be stopping every couple thousand years or so. So let's jump to the next slide now. Before we begin our exploration, it's important to clarify some things regarding this story. Often in this field of study, you'll hear words like population or migration being thrown around as if the audience has a good understanding of what those terms mean. That usually never turns out to be the case.
Mm.
And more often than not, non specialists think of different things when they hear those words. So it would be a good idea to give some key definitions and unpack what we mean. So, first of all, population. In essence, a population is an interbreeding collection of humans who live in the same region. Now, right from the start, I want to state that this is a bit of a arbitrary use of classification that can change depending on context. If you're familiar with ecology, you'll see the term population as a level in an organizational scheme, going from individuals to populations to communities and on until you reach the entire biosphere. In one case of this, populations refer to the total number of a given species in an ecological community. But it can also be used to refer to the total number of a given species in the biosphere as a whole. In sociological or anthropological terms, when somebody talks about the human population, They could be referring to everyone in the city or town, or everyone within the borders of a nation, or just everyone on Earth. Period.
Mm-hmm.
So as you can see, it's a flexible term that depends on context. Now, in the context of human prehistory and geographic expansions, populations tend to be treated more restrictively. You'll hear about a population of people who started migrating from point A and eventually settled at point B, or a population of people entering a region where another population was already living. And often this restriction is tied to traits that the population is supposed to have that distinguishes them from the others. Now, as we've discussed previously, evolutionary change occurs at the level of the population. When an individual is born with a new mutation, if it proves to have survival benefits, it will be passed on to successive generations and may eventually change the genetic composition of the population. But it must be kept in mind, populations are not static entities, forever bound to be one way or the other. In terms of human evolution, as a species, we're very good at moving around and having sex. And not just with members of our own species, it seems, as we previously learned with the Neanderthals and Denisovans. Individual mutations present in geographical populations of humans, no matter where they are, can never be fully isolated from the total gene pool that is Homo sapiens. If I may quote from science writer Steve Olson, writing in his 2002 book Mapping Human History, individual mutations are like drops of water falling on the surface of a pond. The waves from each drop spread out in concentric circles, mixing and blending with the waves from other drops. you know there are no such things as separate human populations, or what we might call races. That's a term with a long history that I'll discuss in the last episode
Mm-hmm.
of the series. We can trace population movements over time, looking at where certain mutations have traveled over generations, and uncover likely homelands, destinations, and routes. But in doing so, we must acknowledge, what context we're using the term population. In our case, the context of changing geographical location over time. The humans who participated in these movements were fluid carriers of certain mutations that changed across thousands of years, freely interacting with other members of our species, as well as several now extinct ones. A quick look at the modern world will show that this has not changed. Um, Also important to clarify is that the term population is different from that of not only race, but also ancestry and ethnicity. When you're talking about the ancestry of a person, we're referring to lines of descent. You recall in the previous episode how the living Mbuti and other Congolese forager groups share ancestry from both the indigenous Central African foragers and the incoming Bantu speaking agriculturalists from West Africa, which again demonstrates how fluid populations can be. Ethnicity refers to the affiliation of a group of people relating to multiple identifying factors, be they nationality, culture, history, language, religion, or whatever. So myself, as Joan Termel, I identify with the Latino ethnicity because my mother is from Puerto Rico. But I also identify with the French Canadian ethnicity because my father is from Maine and his family traces their ancestry to Canada and ultimately to France. So here I'm using ethnicity in the context of history, nationality, and culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I belong to two ethnic groups. So all these terms refer to different things, and they shouldn't be used interchangeably, as other people have done. Now, moving on to the term migration, this one is a bigger one to unpack. When you hear the word migration, you're probably thinking of a journey, sometimes planned, sometimes voluntary, where a group of people completely move from one place to another. But when we're discussing prehistoric human migrations, this is really not what is meant. The peopling of the world, from Africa to Eurasia to Oceania to the Americas, was the result of a gradual population expansion. where the total boundary of our species' geographic range enlarged to include other areas of the world. And when people began to move out of Africa, it's not necessarily that this process was a planned one-way movement. We're so used to thinking in terms of modern national borders and historical definitions of distinct places like Europe or Asia. But our ancestors wouldn't have had any idea about these things.
Hmm.
To them, this was just home, or the hunting grounds, or the woods of beyond, or whatever. You know, Keep in mind that for the most part, Homo sapiens lived in nomadic forager bands. These groups were always subject to changes in composition and location. It was not really a big dramatic situation whenever a local band left the usual range that the regional band occupied. It's easy to conceive that conditions like this played a role in how our species spread its reach across the world. Climate changes, shifts in ecological communities, conflict with neighboring groups, or simply human curiosity. All these factors and more could contribute to the population expansion of Homo sapiens. Now, given this loaded terminology, I'll do my best to avoid using the term migration and instead refer to expansion, when talking about the peopling of the world. And on a related note, when depicting human population expansions on maps, I won't be using arrows
Hmm.
like you see on the image here at the right. Maps like these, even if specialists know what they mean, can lead to confusion in non-specialists. Again, seeming to portray the erroneous assumption of direct one-way movements. It looks about the same as those maps from like World War II atlases, showing
Right.
the travels of armies. Yeah, but they're not very accurate because they give the impression that these were the specific routes that humans' populations took as they moved across the world. But we really can't know this for sure. Data can only reveal so much. You know, we can be sure that people gradually expanded from here to there, and they could have taken any number of routes, and not all necessarily at the same time. It's important to emphasize this because we're talking about periods of time in the thousands or tens of thousands of years that these expansions were occurring. So, how do we know that all of this occurred in the first place? Well, at a basic level, it's obvious. The oldest Homo sapiens remains come from Africa. Then the next oldest come from Southwest Asia and the greater Mediterranean. And then on and on until we find the first remains of Homo sapiens in places like the southern tip of South America. Because all living peoples today belong to the same species, well, they must have expanded their range over such long distances to eventually arrive in the places where their remains have been found. This is the traditional practice seen in archaeology. In the more recent past, like in the Bronze or the Iron Age, um, when archaeologists studied those time periods, well, they used human remains to track movements. It was assumed that the arrival of a new technology in a region, say a pot with a distinctive style, equaled the arrival of a new people in a region. Now, of course, there were also scholars who argued that this was a false equivalency. The arrival of a new type of pot could be nothing more than the result of cultural exchange, like trade. Maybe somebody living where the pot was buried had it traded to them from the place where the pots originated, with no mass migration of peoples required.
Hmm.
Well, this discourse of migration versus diffusion was eventually calmed down in recent decades by much more intense research, as well as the new science of genetics. Now we can test multiple factors to see how peoples moved from place to place, or didn't. And we can confirm or discredit previous findings, or make things even more complicated than we thought, which is not out of place in the real world. If I may shamelessly quote John Green, truth resists simplicity.
Hmm.
Now, a quick word on human genetics. This has really been the biggest source of new information on prehistoric human population expansions. Thanks to the initial baby steps taken in the 1980s, we now have built up a massive and growing database of the world's genetic diversity, incorporating nuclear, mitochondrial, and Y chromosomal DNA of living peoples, as well as that of past peoples. That is to say, their ancient DNA. And we can trace where maternal and paternal haplogroups have traveled, find out which groups admixed with each other based on gene percentages, and pinpoint the times when particular mutations jumped between populations and influenced their evolution. And we've also seen how, deep down, we're all very similar, like 99.9% similar, in
Mm-hmm.
fact. Whatever geographic variations there may be among human populations around the world, the underlying genetic factors responsible for those are basically meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Like that 0.1% difference between humans actually isn't tied to the things that racialists have claimed separate people into distinct groups.
Mm-hmm.
When geneticists study human DNA to learn about history, they'll plot sequences on PCA maps, which show up as these little points. And the points are measured based on relatedness. And these sorts of studies have further demonstrated the tangled web of the human family. When living human DNA is plotted on these PCA maps, it shows up as kind of a bundled mess
Mm-hmm.
with no clear separations. And this is because human populations form clines with each other. These are gradients in genotypic or phenotypic traits across regions. And they further reveal how easily mutations spread out like ripples on a pond. When we look at, say, populations in Europe versus the Middle East, they form a cline. And from the Middle East to India, they also form a cline. And so on all the way to East Asia and beyond. Homo sapiens is a red to blue gradient across the entire world's surface, with really no way to draw a line where red stops and blue begins. Um, the way human societies function as these closely interconnected networks between communities reveals why this is today and in the past as well. And in the next few slides, we're going to see just how people come to settle in new places. And again, it's very complicated. Um, but before we do so, Albert, is there anything you'd like to add?
Not especially, I think. It's good to clarify all these terms that are commonly used in discussing this topic.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Alrighty, let's jump to the next slide then.
Mm-hmm.
So, on the column on the left, we're going to look at range expansion versus range shift. Now, a range expansion is basically what we've been talking about already. When the geographical distribution of a population grows in size. At the top, rectangle A shows a simple local human population, and rectangle B shows the population growing in a northern direction. As you can see, the people in the original range haven't completely left. It's just that some communities have extended what they consider their range of occupation. This is what we see in general when it comes to prehistoric human expansions across the world. A range shift, however, is when a population as a whole changes its distribution, usually in response to certain factors. So, rectangle C shows a local human population living in a particular environment, but then on rectangle D, incoming conditions, in this case, a change in climate to cooler or perhaps hotter conditions, have forced the population to retreat to a different location where the environment is more comfortable to them. In human prehistory, we see this especially with the early sapiens foragers of Europe, where the expansion and retreat of the glaciers acted as a pump,
Mm-hmm.
which either forced populations to move further south where it was warmer, or allowed populations to move further north as tundra conditions let up. And this means that range shifts are not instantaneous events, but can take hundreds to thousands of years. Sometimes a range shift is so dramatic that human communities don't show up in a region for a long time, and these places end up getting recolonized later on. This also seems to have happened at various times in Europe, as we'll see soon when we return to the narrative. Now, moving to the column on the right, we're now going to address the intricacies of what the range of a species population means. So, the total range, basically, is the complete geographic distribution of an organism, in our case, Homo sapiens, as you can see in rectangle A. Because all members of a species can interbreed with each other, as you zoom into a total range, you'll find a series of metapopulations that might be distinct in, say, culture or territory, but they are nonetheless they can interact on multiple levels. And you can see this in rectangle B. And then further zooming into rectangle C, these metapopulations can easily be further subdivided into subsistence groups, in which members of a community, um, in which membership to a community is, relatively constant, but not immutable to change in
Mm.
composition from outside parties. It's important to keep these processes in mind whenever you see a species range map in a field guide or in an encyclopedia.
Mm.
In the context of human population expansions, these are usually the types of relationships that are growing and changing. So let's jump to the next slide now.
Yep.
Uh, Not all species ranges are as evenly spaced as this, however. That was just a helpful chart. In reality, things can be very complicated. In the case of core areas, there might be areas of high settlement within a species range due to specific conditions. For human communities, it may be that some location has an abundance of resources, so more and more people might live there than in the surrounding areas. And it might also be the case that, on the genetic level, these core areas represent points of origin for certain mutations, and by extension, maternal and paternal haplogroups. You'll often see maps like the one of Africa in this column, showing the current distribution of the maternal haplogroup L3. You can see that in some areas of the world, like Anatolia, the Levant, and present day Oman, where the percentage of genetic variance is really high, and that this percentage drops the further you go away from these places. At first glance, it might seem that the L3 haplogroup emerged within the geographic region that contains these high variance points, but word of caution. You always have to check with the data from multiple sources before you go thinking that this area necessarily corresponds to a core area of prolonged settlement
Mm.
or haplogroup origin. This might be a fluke. After all, many haplogroup maps in the United States show similar core areas, but we know from modern history that these points of origin derive from European or African sources. Those specific haplogroups didn't emerge on the continent originally. Now, moving on to the rightmost column, we find the phenomenon of dispersal. In biology, a dispersal is when members of a species population move from one place to another. So it's kind of an interchangeable term with migration. It doesn't necessarily have to be one way. You know, there's always the potential for backwards movements, as well as the establishment of gene flow. Um, and should the region of dispersal already be inhabited by members of the same or a closely related species? In the context of human population expansions, we can recognize two important types of dispersals. One, there are jump dispersals, which I show above. When humans will willingly bypass areas of land that may not be productive to survival and head straight for the region that is further away but is much more feasible.
Mm.
You'll see this a lot with human settlements within island chains. One instance of this that researchers think occurred, but which I'll elaborate on in the next episode, is the settlement of the Greater Antilles in the Caribbean, in which Amerindians might have undergone an initial jump dispersal along the Lesser Antilles to reach the larger northward islands first. Then, number two, there are the coastal dispersals, which I show below, where humans move along a shoreline route as they expand their populations to new lands. There's about two ways that they might do this, depending on the conditions of the overall environment. So in rectangle A, they might choose to stay along the coast only, at which point communities might end up admixing with their immediate neighbors. Rectangle B shows a more expansive coastal dispersal, where some groups might stay along the coast, but others choose to expand their range further inland. Now, the range of exchange and admixture in this case is even greater than before. We'll talk a little bit about some models of human settlement in Eurasia and the Americas, where some researchers feel that the model in rectangle A more accurately describes the pattern of initial settlement,
Mm.
but not everyone agrees. Um, Before we move on, Albert, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, not really.
Alrighty, let's go to the next slide then. Um, One of the most important things that I've continuously emphasized in this series is that most of Africa and Eurasia was already populated with human
Mm.
species long before Homo sapiens emerged. And as we evolved and expanded our range, we came in contact with these other species, often coexisting and often interbreeding with them. In the case of our species movements, however, we became the first hominins to settle some parts of the world. To our knowledge, we were the only species of human to have made a home in Australia and in the Americas.
Mm.
That seems to be the most likely case based on the current evidence we have. So the story of human population expansion is one of equal parts coexistence with other humans and writing it out alone in a land with no resident human population. This chart in the left column gives a rough summary of the varying factors that go into human settlement in either scenario. There is some there's some general trends that are seen in an otherwise complex process. Uh, in places where there is no residential human population, incoming sapiens tend to find themselves learning everything for themselves. They might be at the they might have the benefit of previous preserved knowledge, especially if an environment is similar to the one their ancestors have traveled before. But if an environment is wildly different, well, then the learning process will be slow and shallow at first. In places where there is a resident human population, incoming sapiens face several options. Should they or their neighbors choose not to interact, well, then they still have to learn most things on their own. But they can use clues from their neighbors to figure out a few things.
Mm.
Now, should they, or again their neighbors, decide to give limited contact, or maybe even act hostile to them, then the learning process might be fastened through copying. So, say someone finds a piece of hunting technology from a neighboring community, and it's one that they know works even better than their old tools. Well, they could figure out how to use and improve their hunting expeditions with this new technology. Or they can see that their neighbors prefer to gather certain foods that your community is not used to eating. They can try it out for themselves and maybe find that it's more nutritious than some of the older foods, and so end up gathering more of that new resource. Now, should incoming sapiens or their neighbors choose to keep full interaction with each other, cooperation if you like, well, then learning curve rises dramatically.
Mm.
It becomes so much easier to adapt to a new environment because your neighbors are all too willing to help you. In the historical record, and probably in prehistory as well, humans behaved in all of these ways. And it was through some or all of these factors that Homo sapiens settled around the world. Um, One last reminder before moving on are the limitations to this type of research. Albert, I'm
Mm.
sure you can agree that the nature of fossil preservation is seldom perfect,
Right.
and that just because you find the first or the last known member of a fossil species doesn't necessarily mean that older or younger remains won't be found.
Mm-hmm.
The study of sapiens population expansions has been made even more complicated by this fact. Sometimes we find remains of humans in parts of the world that are far older than the oldest known remains, and that causes researchers to go back to the data and see how this new evidence fits with the overall picture. In recent years, this has proven so great that our entire understanding of the range expansions of Homo sapiens has changed. It's far more complicated than we ever thought. And this is something we'll see as we progress through this episode. So let's jump to the next slide now.
Yep.
We've previously spoken quite a bit at length about our origins in Africa, but the story of sapiens expansions outside the continent has been historically linked with the former. That's because for many decades there has been this dichotomy in paleoanthropology between researchers who backed a multi regional model for human origins and an out of Africa replacement model for human origins. Simply put, the multi regional model tied the origin of Homo sapiens with the evolutionary history of the erectines and their kin. So, living humans, according to this model, descended from separate populations across Africa and Eurasia, which all shared regional continuity with each other. So, for example, Europeans today were supposed to trace their lineage all the way back to Middle Pleistocene ancestors, including Neanderthals, which then gradually evolved into Homo sapiens convergently with other populations in Africa and East Asia and Oceania. Uh, of course, this essentially would mean that Homo sapiens is a polyphyletic group,
Mm.
which sounds really great if you're a racialist, because then you can have separate, distant origins for the different human races. Now the out of Africa replacement model of human origins places the base of our species as a whole firmly in Africa, where the oldest definitive fossils have been found. And from there, our ancestors were supposed to have spread across the continent and then around the world, where we replaced all the other human species, like the Neanderthals and like Homo erectus, until we were the only ones left. Well, if you haven't figured out already, both models have their share of holes. Um, well, the multi-regional model definitely has big holes. I mean, based on genetic studies, much of the ancestry of people in Eurasia and the Americas and Oceania is derived from a common African ancestry, which makes up about 98.5 to 91.8% of non-African ancestry. And this was very recent too. This appeared in parts of the world long after species like Homo erectus died out, and long after the Neanderthal and Denisovan lineage emerged. Um, this isn't what we'd find in the genetic data if the multi-regional model was accurate.
Mm.
Now, as far as the out of Africa replacement model shows, it's a lot closer to the data,
Mm.
but it's missing a key component. We know that our species interbred with other humans, both in Africa and in Eurasia. Living populations can trace some of their ancestry back to Neanderthals and Denisovans and several unknown species. The traditional out of Africa model then was supposed to state that there was no interbreeding of any sort. It was supposed to be a total demographic replacement, but that's not what the data shows.
Mm.
In reality, for all the decades of discourse, neither model fully reflects the total state of the evidence. The dispersal of Homo sapiens across Africa and the rest of the world seems to have been a very complex process. We've already seen how our species' origin might have been Pan-African, involving multiple populations of humans interbreeding with each other to provide us with the mosaic of features we see in our anatomy today.
Mm.
The evidence has been suggesting that early Homo sapiens likely began expanding its range into Eurasia at earlier times, likely representing multiple movements by different populations at various periods. And some of these seem to have interbred with a few human species too. Genetic studies in particular have kind of repeatedly converged on an interval of time between 60 and 50,000 years ago, where Homo sapiens underwent a main population expansion. This is the one that contributed the most to all present day non African ancestry. So far, the evidence isn't clear whether these later sapiens migrants met up with previous sapiens migrants. There was one DNA study from 2016 by Luca Pagani and colleagues that found that 2% of the genome of living peoples on New Guinea derived from an earlier population of Homo sapiens.
Mm.
But subsequent genetic studies have failed to replicate these findings.
Mm.
For the time being, it seems the descendants of these first expansions have died out without leaving a trace in our DNA.
Mm.
Time will tell if that holds up. But of course, our ancestors descending from the 60 to 50,000 year expansion did interbreed multiple times with other human species, and their histories have now become forever intertwined with ours.
Mm.
Neanderthals, Denisovans, and kin, no matter how small their contribution was to our current ancestry today, they're our ancestors as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Now, the two models on the left demonstrate two ways that recent researchers have thought to picture human origins. So for B on the right, you have sort of a simple phylogeny. which is what you typically see in the conventional cladistic analysis. These can provide good data, but they're not complete either.
Mm.
If we move to Model A on the left, that better reflects what we know. Incorporates fission fusion relationships and gene flow, as well as local extinctions. All of which would have occurred during our population expansion across Eurasia and beyond. So why did our species begin to move beyond the African continent anyway? Well, you may recall from the last episode that Africa faced a number of severe megadroughts beginning around 135,000 years ago and appearing periodically until about 70,000 years ago when they stopped. Some researchers have argued that these droughts played a key role in some of our species making a northeastward spread into Eurasia. You know, these might explain some of the earlier movements of Homo sapiens, but there's still the issue of the main one 60 to 50,000 years ago, which occurred after the fact. Turns out there was a really cool study that came out from 2017 by Jessica Turney and colleagues that involved core samples that were taken from 3 sites that lie very close to Northeast Africa. So one from the Gulf of Aden, between Somalia and Yemen, one from the Sorek Cave in Israel, and one from the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. I'll explain the specifics of this study in a little bit, but basically the gist is that the population expansions out of Africa during the main event can best be explained as the result of climatic factors, that corresponded with interglacial and glacial periods, which either provided people with new lands full of resources or forced them to find faraway lands with those things. And of course, we can't forget that these population expansions were not one-way events. Homo sapiens groups would have returned to the African continent on multiple occasions, probably thinking that it was nothing more than part of their natural range. One of these events happened as early as 70,000 years ago, which incidentally is right when the last mega drought was ending. So, before we begin our road trip officially, Albert, is there anything you'd like to add?
I don't think so. That was a pretty good summary of the whole issues.
Oh, well, thank you, thank you. Let's all right, let's hop in the car and let's go to the next slide. Now, for the purposes of this episode, y'all are gonna be seeing a lot of maps like this, scattered about with relevant archaeological sites. I assure you all, we are not going to go through every single one of these. We do not have the time. They're just here to give some idea of not only the range of dates for Homo sapiens affiliated sites, but also which parts of the world have yielded more sites than others. You'll notice there are many places where our sample size is low to non-existent. And they are active areas of study for paleoanthropologists and geneticists trying to kind of understand this complex story. So looking at the aforementioned early sapiens expansions, the ones which don't seem to have left any genetic evidence in living peoples, many of them are found in the general Eastern Mediterranean, and they extend across the Arabian Peninsula. Currently, the oldest one of them all is the specimen Apodema 1 from the Apodema Cave in Greece. This site was discovered in the 1970s, and it contained 2 skulls, both of which were thought to have been Neanderthals, but were poorly known otherwise. Recent work from just a few years ago have clarified things. One of the skulls was of a Neanderthal, which only dated back to around 170,000 years ago, but the other, the one that we're concerned with here, was found to have been around 210,000 years old, and more in line with the variation seen in early Homo sapiens. So that makes it the oldest known member of our species to have reached Europe, over 160,000 years earlier than previous finds. The most parsimonious explanation, and that's not really saying much because this is such a new find, is that this group of Homo sapiens must have peopled this part of Europe prior to 210,000 years ago, only for their overall population to decline so much that incoming Neanderthals replaced them by 170,000 years ago. After which, the Neanderthal record in the southern Mediterranean continues until Homo sapiens shows up again by 45 50,000 years ago or so. Now, to reach the Grecian archipelago, early Homo sapiens probably took a route through the Levant, and it's there that we find more evidence of an early Eurasian presence. The next oldest site is Mislia Cave in Israel, 194 to 177,000 years ago. And two famous finds come from the School and Kufsa caves in Israel, which are dated to between 130 and 90,000 years ago. Now, these are younger than the Apodema 1 remains, so either they represent another population expansion or they're just remnants of that earlier one. These remains, including fairly good skulls, were previously explained, and you'll see this in some older literature, as a failed dispersal. An early attempt at a Eurasian expansion that failed, after which the Israeli caves were reoccupied by Neanderthals who replaced this overall population. It sounds very similar to the Greek situation, eh?
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's hard to confirm the details of these observations. We know that Neanderthals began to expand their range into Southwest Asia around 70 to 50,000 years ago, and that postdates these Israeli remains. But we've also found remains of later Homo sapiens groups in the Levant at about that time.
Hmm.
And we know of an instance of Neanderthal interbreeding by 55,000 years ago. So was there ever interactions like admixture between Neanderthals and these earlier sapiens populations? Possibly. A 2016 study by Martin Kulwem and colleagues found possible evidence of an admixture event occurring around 100,000 years ago between a population of Homo sapiens and the ancestors of a Neanderthal that lived in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Now, the authors don't speculate that our species managed to travel all the way into the cooler parts of Eurasia to have initiated this contact. Instead, they propose that this admixture occurred somewhere in Southwest Asia and that the Altai Neanderthal population likely stemmed from an eastward movement sometime afterward.
Hmm.
So, maybe earlier intervening events occurred between the two species, but we can't say for sure. So let's jump to the next slide now.
Yep.
Here's some photos showing a few of the remains of our species' early adventures in Southwest Asia. The presence of such old remains in comparison to those in Africa have led to some suggestions by researchers that maybe it would be more accurate to extend our species origin to include not just Africa, but the neighboring Mediterranean region as well. So we would be an Afro-Mediterranean species, which is always interesting to think about. In any case, even if these early expansions didn't contribute any genetic trace in living human populations, it is probably inaccurate to think of them as failed. As we'll see later in this episode, we found early Homo sapiens remains as far as East Asia and possibly Australia too. And the time span between these remains and those like Apodema and Mislia are pretty great. You're looking at something like 130,000 years, which is far longer than the 60 to 50,000 years it took for the main expansion event. If all these early remains are linked together, well, then they represent a human population that did very well for themselves. So, returning to the question of the reason why Homo sapiens began expanding into Eurasia, many researchers have looked at paleoclimate and environmental records to see what the conditions were like when sapiens were inhabiting places like Southwest Asia. Today, this region is known for its desert and scrubland environments, although the more mountainous regions contain grassland as well as coniferous forest. But remember that the global climate changed a lot during the last ice age. Glacial periods brought cool and dry periods, interglacials, warm and wet periods. A growing area of study in the Arabian Peninsula has revealed evidence that the region was much wetter in the distant past. To talk about a green Arabia. For example, between 130 and 115,000 years ago, a region that has been called the Tabuk Corridor opened from the Levant to Arabia, where freshwater rivers and wetlands flowed for a while. And in another area, at various intervals between 125 and 80,000 years ago, a paleo lake was present in present-day Mudafan in southern Arabia. that extended some 300 square kilometers. And there was accompanying evidence there for wetland animals like hippos that were hanging out in the area. So if we look back to the Turney et al. 2017 study, those core samples from the Eastern Mediterranean and the Gulf of Aden show that, in general, the entire region was a lot wetter and warmer between a period of time from 120 and 90,000 years ago. And this is demonstrated at the chart from the study at the left here. So, at least for some of the earlier dispersals that Homo sapiens took, the transition across continents would have been fairly seamless.
Hmm.
People could have traveled along vegetated and riverine corridors, and they certainly had plenty of game animals to hunt and food plants to gather. The 121 to 112,000-year-old human footprints from grassland deposits in Saudi Arabia, here at the bottom rightmost image, only further add to this growing evidence. Um, Albert, is there anything you'd like to add?
I don't think so. That all makes quite a bit of sense to me.
Alrighty. Well, yeah, like this climatological data provides some context for the
Hmm.
early expansions, but what about the main one? The one that
Hmm.
can be traced in the genetics of living peoples today. Well, if we jump to the next slide,
Yep.
again, it must be emphasized that based on current DNA studies, all living non-African Homo sapiens can trace their ancestry to a single source population that was present somewhere in Southwest Asia and dispersed across the world around 60 to 50,000 years ago. The evidence behind this understanding is pretty strong. I mean, nuclear DNA supports it, mitochondrial and Y chromosomal DNA adds further support. In fact, researchers have actually been able to single out the maternal haplogroup L3 and the paternal haplogroup CT as the primary ones involved in the Eurasian population expansion. The threads of living human ancestry in different parts of the world, like Europe or the Americas or Australia, they can all trace back here to the geographic borders between Northeast Africa and Southwest Asia. Now, there have been a number of archaeological sites that might represent individuals associated with this specific expansion. Sites 1, 2, 3 on the map in particular do fall within the time frame of the expansion, but whether they do or not, it seems likely that this part of the world was inhabited by Homo sapiens anyway for quite a while. At most, they were living in pockets of resource-rich land, the refugia, as they're called. Now, going back to the Turney et al. 2017 study that analyzed those core samples, they found that beginning around 80,000 years ago or so, the climate in Southwest Asia changed dramatically. It became much cooler and drier than it previously was.
Hmm.
And this was a result of a much larger phenomenon, as the ice sheets had been steadily expanding since 115,000 years ago, starting a transition between an interglacial and a glacial period. In fact, this was the last glacial period before the start of the Holocene. The deserts and the scrublands expanded, all those rivers and wetlands dried up, and much of the wildlife in the region either died out or moved to greener pastures. So, incoming Homo sapiens in Northeast Africa, whether through the Sinai Peninsula or through the Bab el Mandeb Strait, or both, seem to have been pushed into the region due to the dwindling conditions. Their resources were somewhere far away from their homelands, and it would have been a choice between adaptation or expansion. And given the ingenuity of our species, and the fact that we do see some archaeological sites in the drying areas, well, different nomadic communities probably resorted to both strategies. Now, one curiosity in human genetics research is the presence of DNA within some human groups that belongs to a population that isn't present in the world today.
Hmm.
Between 44 and 66% of the ancestry in the incipient or early agriculturalists in Southwest Asia, and as much as 44% of the ancestry of the earliest European Homo sapiens groups of 45,000 years ago, all hail from this population, which geneticists have given the rather poor name of Basal Eurasian.
Hmm.
Uh, Albert, why is this such a poor name?
Oh man, well, a discourse about how to apply the term basal is it can get pretty heated. But oftentimes the term basal is used to indicate essentially a less diverse group that is outside of a perhaps more diverse group that whoever is speaking is interested in. So if we use a bird example from my field, oftentimes people might consider the paleonates to be basal. They are the less diverse group out of the two main lineages of living birds. And if you haven't seen or have forgotten from what we covered in my bird evolution series, the paleonates are the group that includes the ostriches and emus and a lot of other flightless birds like that, as well as the flying tinamous from South America. And so this leads to kind of a conception that they are more primitive than other living birds, but that's not necessarily true. And we know that they have undergone kind of their own an evolution and quite extensive evolutionary history. And so oftentimes the term basal is used as a convenient way to say that this is a group that is that's less diverse than the group that I'm interested in, but it is also a sort of misleading term, and so a number of people have quite strongly argued against using it as in this fashion.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, like that makes a lot of sense. I know I have seen the one response by a botanist, I think, who was like looking at a plant family tree,
Hmm.
and then the most basal lineage was that of human beings.
Right, right. Yeah, it's a very context dependent kind of term because, yeah, it's but because people equate it with I guess being primitive or being older when it's not necessarily the case essentially. Yep. Mm.
Right, exactly. Well, all right then, excellent. Let's jump to the next slide. Um, and this just kind of clarifies a couple things that we've
Mm.
discussed.
Mm.
So like that leftmost chart again that highlights the drying and cooling conditions that probably prompted our expansions into Eurasia. And the right one here comes from a very recent paper. It's a simplified diagram of the this main Eurasian expansion and its context to greater human history. What's so curious about the basal Eurasians is that this population is known entirely from DNA studies. We have no human remains that can be positively identified with them yet. And not only that, while they share a common ancestry with living non-Africans today, they actually appear to have diverged from our global population before the main expansion 60 to 50,000 years ago. We can only speculate as to their impact on the world stage. They don't appear to have interbred much with Neanderthals at any point, if at all. And while the percentage of their ancestry is high in early Southwest Asian peoples, it's actually hard to say just where they lived. The most parsimonious hypothesis is that they did live in Southwest Asia. But considering how close the ancestries of the early agriculturalists of the Middle East are with North Africans, we can't ignore the possibility that they may have resided there too.
Mm.
You know, do they have anything to do with the earlier interglacial expansions of Homo sapiens? If we ever manage to sequence DNA from those remains, are we going to find these basal Eurasian genes? And then, of course, what happened to them? Is their disappearance the result of a demographic shift? Did repeated admixtures swamp their communities into the greater population of these regions? Well, more research will be needed to tell
Mm.
for
Mm.
sure. So let's jump to the next slide now.
Right.
Uh, what do we know about the culture and technology of the Homo sapiens communities who settled here, while their neighbors went on to people greater Eurasia? Well, for one thing, it does seem that demographic shifts were likely the main factor that ended Neanderthal life in the Levant and in the more northerly areas of Southwest Asia. But this probably occurred very slowly, since we know that our species coexisted with Neanderthals in the area for many thousands of years. It's absolutely reasonable to speculate that the two species shared a lot more than genes. We can't roll out cultural exchanges that might have helped either species learn new survival strategies or new methods of technological manufacture. One really interesting observation that might reveal just how this process might have gone is through the study of the different stone toolkits that came and went in this region. In the Levant, in particular, two types are known. We have the Emiran toolkit of 50 to 40,000 years ago, and the Amarian toolkit of 46 to 34,000 years ago. Both of these use level wall techniques, which you recall are mostly associated with Middle Pleistocene humans
Hmm.
like Neanderthals, as well as the African Middle Stone Age. Um, in the Amiran toolkit, you'll find that level wall cores and flakes were fairly common, alongside microliths and other tools that are typical of Homo sapiens toolkits. But by the time the Amarian toolkit shows up, level wall practices are almost gone, and the more common tools include these characteristic lengthy curved blades that are unlike what we see in neighboring Neanderthal toolkits. Um, and of importance to note is that the Neanderthals die out in the Levant within the time frame that the Amarian toolkit is used.
Hmm.
So what we may be seeing is a quote unquote real time shift that was purposeful away from the sort of older level wall techniques that are characteristic of Neanderthals, as
Hmm.
well as that of older Homo sapiens, and towards newer tool technologies that were much easier for the tasks needed of them,
Hmm. Hmm.
and probably much easier to transport too. So, as Homo sapiens entered Southwest Asia as nomadic foragers, it seems that their societal organization did well for them throughout their early history in this region. Several sites have been found that show open air occupations among areas of grassland, as well as the more refugial areas that we talked about earlier, particularly in the Levant. That seems to have been a very comfortable place for early peoples at this time.
Hmm.
Um, it was during especially dry periods that it's likely that humans were more nomadic. They could follow important game animals like deer, goats, gazelles, and pigs, as well as hares and tortoises, all of which are found at Southwest Asian sites during this time. Humans would have grown very familiar with the local flora as well, and we see evidence that they were feasting on almonds and legumes and various grasses,
Hmm.
as well as date fruits, which I've had the pleasure of trying. They're really good.
Yeah.
Um, we also find sites located in caves. So that kind of suggests that nomadic groups could settle there for a while in relative safety. Um, at the Kaldar cave in Iran, of which human remains there have made headline news recently,
Oh yeah.
because they've recently been dated, and they're waiting for the paper to come out.
Hmm.
They've recently been dated to 63,000 years ago.
Hmm.
So that's significant. That makes them the oldest human remains for our species in Iran.
Hmm.
So that's pretty exciting. But we find that the Zagros Mountains provided great shelters for human communities. Hearths could be lit, and local materials could be used in the construction of tools. Um, in Iran, for example, we have the Baradostian toolkit, which emerges there by 35,000 years ago. But people also built rock shelters alongside the caves so they could kind of increase their living space a little bit. The photo here shows the Baz rock shelter in Syria, which is 38 to 33,000 years old. Now, in talking about toolkits, we can see the use of Southwest Asia as a route to the rest of Eurasia in the similarities shared between the construction of all these various tools. So the Amarian and the Baradostian toolkits in particular have been proposed and certainly have been observed to share very close similarities to European toolkits, like the Aurignacian or the Bohunician, which we'll examine later in this episode. In fact, for a brief time, Aurignacian tools from Europe were being made in the Levant.
Hmm.
So is this evidence of links between cultures? Or maybe this is a trail of footprints that leads people from the Levant and Iran to Southeast Europe.
Hmm.
It's possible, and there's at least some genetic evidence that provides some support for this. Um, All right. As far as Southwest Asia goes, Albert, do you have anything to add?
Uh, Nothing except to say that's all really interesting. Definitely wasn't really familiar with much of this information.
Yeah, I mean, same here initially. Um, all righty, let's move to the next region then on the next slide.
Right?
Now, when we reach the Indian subcontinent, or South Asia, if you like, things get a little bit fuzzy. The archaeological record here is actually quite patchy.
Hmm.
So we know that humans of some sort were here between 300 and 125,000 years ago. This is based on a cranium that was found in Hapnora. And have been Middle Stone Age toolkits that have been unearthed from a period of 385 to 172,000 years ago. Of course, since we found remains of Homo erectus in China and Southeast Asia, many hundreds of years earlier than this, then it stands to reason that a human presence on the subcontinent runs fairly deep. Um, but it's when our species, Homo sapiens, enters the chat that we run into some discourse. It follows a similar pattern. So the oldest definitively known remains come from two sites, Fa Hien Lena and Badadomda Lena, which are both in Sri Lanka, and these date to around 30,000 years ago. But of course, we know that members of the main expansion reached East Asia and Australia by 50,000 years ago,
Hmm.
and they are linked genetically to the peoples of India. So there must have been people here earlier than 30,000 years
Hmm.
ago.
Hmm.
So where are they? Well, evidence from microlithic toolkits, which are characteristic of Homo sapiens, these make up the bulk of the archaeological sites in India, including Fa Hien Lena, where tools of that sort have been dated to 48,000 years ago. Now, provided that these tools were crafted by our species, well, then that kind of shortens this gap a little bit.
Hmm.
But more skeletal evidence would definitely help big time. Now, South Asia represents a sort of ecological milestone for our species. Since we're generalist specialists, which, if you remember, are species that can adapt to almost any environment, specialize on the resources there, and change that readily if they need to, well, then they manage to easily transition between two biogeographic realms.
Hmm.
So you have the southern Palearctic that we've been hanging out in for quite a long time,
Hmm.
and the western Indo-Malayan, or in older literature, the Oriental realm. But I think it's best if we leave that term
Hmm.
behind. Um, these two regions, have different plants, different animals, and different climatic conditions. In fact, in South Asia, even during the ice ages, the overall environment seems to have stayed relatively stable.
Hmm.
It contained a mosaic of biomes, much as it does today, with forests and grasslands and so forth. Homo sapiens settling here would have dealt with non migratory animals that grazed and hunted on year round foliage that barely changed from winter to summer. The limited archaeology we have tells us that South Asian populations adapted well to this tropical region. In fact, at the older layers of the Fa Hien Lena site in Sri Lanka, researchers have actually unearthed the earliest known remains of the bow and arrow outside of Africa.
Hmm.
I have the picture of them shown here at the bottom right. They're 48,000 years old, and it's a hunting tool that is famously perfect for wooded environments. Those sorts of animals that people here would have been hunting, like deer and gazelle. Now, the transition between realms might have even gone much smoother, since it appears that there might have been another human species in South Asia at the same time. Now, you may recall from our discussion on human interbreeding from the Neanderthal episode that some genetic studies have indicated an admixture event occurring prior to the peopling of East Asia and Oceania,
Hmm. Right.
after the one with Neanderthals in Southwest Asia, which appears in a diluted form today, but may have made up as much as 2.6 to 3.4% of the ancestry of the following sapiens groups in Southern Asia and beyond. That study, which again is Texeria and Cooper 2019, hypothesized that this interbreeding probably took place in South Asia with a mystery human species that appears to have been equally related to both the Neanderthals and the Denisovans.
Hmm.
It's on that lineage somewhere.
Right.
So yeah, there is clearly a rich history here on the Indian subcontinent that still remains a great mystery. Um, so then let's move on now to the next slide.
Yep.
Another new region of the world.
Mm.
Um, if you thought South Asia had a mysterious archaeological record, well, Southeast Asia has such an increasingly better archaeological record
Mm.
that the more remains we find, the more mysterious it gets.
Mm.
Um, during the glacial periods of the last ice age, much of Malaysia and Indonesia was connected to the mainland via fallen sea levels. And what was originally an archipelago turned into a many plateaued peninsula. The researchers have named Sunda, or Sundaland, after the Sunda continental shelf, which is today, of course, underwater. Now, today, the environmental conditions in Southeast Asia are famous for the rich biodiverse rainforests. But during the periods when Sunda was present, the area actually seems to have been much more harsh.
Mm.
So the paleoenvironmental data that we have suggests that, well, for one, the falls in sea level would have harmed many of the coastline communities, turning them all into dead zones that took quite a bit of time to recover to stable conditions. Secondly, when the sea levels fell, so many areas of land emerged that neighboring seas were sunk, which would reduce the level of evaporation, which is already pretty low due to the cooling climate.
Mm.
So when the monsoon rains would come, there was much less moisture there to be incorporated. And so many parts of Sunda experienced very low rainfall. There still would have been wetter patches of rainforest, but a huge chunk of the area would have turned into a dry seasonal forest
Mm.
or even open savanna. And these changes would have greatly affected animal communities, creating these pockets of refugia that we've talked about before. And this likely would have influenced human evolution in the area as well. We know that at least two human species were present in Sunda and the neighboring islands until about 50,000 years ago, these being Homo floresiensis on Flores Island and Homo luzonensis in the northern Philippines.
Mm.
The deep history of these species is currently debated. We have next to nothing anatomy wise for luzonensis that we can compare to other species. I mean, all we know is that the population seems to have been pretty small in stature. We know a great deal more about Floresiensis. What little phylogenetic work has been done at least points in the direction of the Habeline grade, which we've talked about before. But again, like this is still a debated topic. Um, both species might have a history in the region going back over 700,000 years or more. But beyond that, we have no consensus on where they came from. Now, of course, right on time for this series, as seems to be the case for a lot of these episodes I've been making. A study came out right as I was working on this that kind of gave us a state of affairs situation regarding Southeast Asia.
Mm.
This incidentally is also by Texiera and colleagues. Um, and they were basically looking at the high levels of Denisovan admixture that are present in Southeast Asian populations, especially the more indigenous forager communities, as well as the indigenous Australians and peoples of New Guinea and so forth. While they were able to detect again like these high percentages of admixture, which are probably the result of multiple interbreeding events, it turns out that they have not been able to find any so-called super archaic DNA, which in genetic speak is basically human lineages that diverged earlier than our common ancestor with Neanderthals and Denisovans.
Mm.
And so they were speculating that, is it possible that maybe Homo luzonensis and Homo floresiensis are actually more in common with these later lineages of peoples than with that earlier Habeline grade?
Mm.
Maybe as had been previously hypothesized, instead like maybe both these populations are the result of like an extreme form of island dwarfism,
Mm.
and that it's so reduced their height and their overall build from the previous generations that it actually brought back traits that are more in line with earlier hominins
Mm.
than in present day humans. So, like, the habelineness of Homo floresiensis is maybe an artifact of recent evolution and
Mm.
not a holdover from an earlier ancestry. In fact, they even go as far as speculate, well, maybe Floresiensis and Luzonensis are Denisovans that went through this process.
Huh.
Um, but, and this is a big but,
Mm.
at the end of the day, they basically kind of say we can't know for sure.
Right, right.
We have no way to test these at the moment, and we really need more evidence to find out whether any of these ideas holds in the water.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Um, so yeah, as you can see, the archaeology and the genetics done in this region is bringing a lot of fascinating discussions.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, again, even more mysterious is this apparent presence of Denisovan DNA throughout the indigenous groups of Southeast Asia and Oceania. We have evidence of at least two admixture events, which contributed as much as 5 to 8% of the ancestry to these living peoples. And so this has suggested to some researchers that, again, the range of this human species perhaps extended into Sunda and perhaps even across the islands to New Guinea. And on top of that, going back to the 2019 study by Texiera and Cooper, there was an admixture event on the island of Flores between the indigenous Homo sapiens community and yet another mystery human species
Mm.
that shared ancestry with the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. Um, so, yeah, that makes at most four human species that were already living here when the first Homo sapiens populations began to expand here before 50,000 years ago. So, quite crowded. um, Now, some sites show evidence of sapiens occupation earlier than this. So we have a Lida Ager in Sumatra, which is dated to 73 to 63,000 years ago, and has brought us teeth that are very characteristic of Homo sapiens. You have to remember that our teeth have diagnostic traits that are different from all the other hominins.
Mm.
Tam Ba Ling Cave in Laos has revealed, much more evidence. We have actual skeletons or parts of skeletons with very clear Homo sapiens features that are between 70 and 48,000 years old.
Mm.
So maybe these have something to do with the earlier sapiens expansions, that predated the main event. Or perhaps, they were related to the main expansion after all. Um, we lack DNA from these remains, so we can't test that at the moment. Um, Much more definite genetic and archaeological evidence from Australia points to a clear settlement of Sunda by 50,000 years ago, or at about that time. Some species had at least a foothold here by then.
Mm.
Now, the genetic connection of Sunda and the neighboring islands to Greater Eurasia is very strong. DNA studies have linked some indigenous forager populations on the Andaman Islands, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines to the earliest Homo sapiens populations that settled here,
Mm.
as well as in South Asia, East Asia, and Oceania. So, yeah, much like Africa, the introduction and spread of agricultural peoples and their languages has dramatically changed their way of life. So we'll hear a little bit more about that complicated story in the next episode. But on to the next slide. Um, as you can imagine, based on the fact that much of Sunda is now underwater,
Mm.
archaeology here has quite a couple obstacles to face. The rise in sea levels following the end of the last ice age appears to have been near catastrophic here. Destroying coastal areas through rapid flooding and pushing all these biological communities northwards into the plateaus that would become the islands of Indonesia and Malaysia. Any forager groups that had made a home in the river valleys or in these grassland corridors of Sunda, would have found themselves forced to leave everything they couldn't carry behind. So, should underwater archaeology not advance in technology and methods, it's likely that we won't be able to find traces of these lowland communities anytime soon.
Mm.
But that being said, Southeast Asian archaeology has still provided some good data. The nature of the landscape with its plateaus and valleys seems to have facilitated the development of varying cultural traditions. In areas where the coasts have since recovered following the fall in sea levels, Humans could have easily made use of marine resources. And the presence of populations in the Philippines and in the island collection of Wallacea points very strongly to the case that watercraft was being used before 50,000 years ago.
Mm.
The fact that humans, and including non Homo sapiens species perhaps, crossed the famed Wallace line,
Mm.
that represents another key innovation in the history of our hominin lineage. To reach these islands would have required open sea crossings,
Right.
and these lands were not connected to Sunda during the Pleistocene. The distances we're talking about here between islands could be as wide as 66 kilometers. And when you take the whole area of Wallacea together, you're looking at 347,000 square kilometers.
Mm.
So that's huge. Um, Studies suggest that most of the islands were within viewing distance of each other,
Mm.
and so navigation was at least significantly easier than it could have been.
Mm.
Now, the Wallace line, as well as the related Weber line, functions as a great barrier for animal life.
Mm.
It's underrun with very deep channels, and many animal groups on opposite sides of the lines do not cross it.
Right.
In fact, I think I read somewhere that some birds won't even migrate across the Wallace
Yeah.
line. So yeah, it effectively makes it a delineating area between the faunas of Eurasia and the faunas of Australasia, aka two different biogeographical realms.
Mm.
So for humans to make it across, where most, but not all, of the other mammals haven't, that is an achievement that is often kind of glanced over in the usual accounts of our population expansions. What the watercraft used for these trips were like, we don't know for sure. I mean, we have ethnographic evidence from indigenous Australians and Melanesians that show paddled bark canoes and bamboo rafts that were known seafaring technologies to these peoples, or at least freshwater technologies. Um, but the outrigger canoe, which is common among the Polynesians and related groups, that appears to have been a much later invention by the Austronesian speaking peoples in Southeast Asia.
Mm.
My reading of the literature suggests that researchers are actually kind of split on the matter here. Some of them argue that these canoes and rafts wouldn't have been enough for Wallaceans to cross the various islands, while others say, oh, they were just fine for these types of journeys. The conditions were fairly good. They wouldn't have had any issues taking a raft from island to island. Of course, I don't have a personal stake
Mm.
in this discourse, but I mean, based on what we know of Pacific history and how influential the outrigger canoe was in peopling very distant islands from Wallacea and from parts of Melanesia, I think this latter argument that they would have been good enough seems to hold the most water.
Mm.
No pun intended, of course.
Mm.
Now, archaeological sites suggest that peoples in Sunda and Wallacea made use of a variety of different resources, as foraging peoples tend to do today. Keystone toolkits are known in the region. The most characteristic of all of them is the Hoapinian, which new research shows first emerged in southern China around 43,500 years ago, before spreading southwards as far as Sumatra.
Mm.
This is composed of cores and flakes, as well as ground axes and grindstones. And many of these stone tools appear to have been crafted from river pebbles. And as a whole, this technology is associated with the tropical rainforest environments that appear to have been limited in range in the drier, low sea level world of Sunda.
Mm.
Organic materials would have provided equal opportunities for construction, even though for archaeologists, these are frustrations because these types of materials tend not to last
Mm.
in rainforest soils, at least. Of the Hoabinian toolkit on the mainland, we do find bone points and spatulas, one, and in Wallacea, there is limited evidence for bone and shell tools. Um, if anything, we have more evidence of their leftovers that gives us ideas about their cultural lives. The Jaramalai shelter in East Timor has preserved around 39,000 fish bones, including pelagic species like tuna and mackerel. So these people were probably engaging in deep ocean fishing. to get their meals, or at least some of their meals. Um, but the most lovely evidence of early human culture, at least in my opinion, are the aesthetic images.
Mm.
In fact, currently, the oldest known figurative artwork for Homo sapiens anywhere is at Laing Tadongi in Sulawesi. I probably butchered that name, I apologize. But I show the image of it here. So it's dated at most to 45,500 years ago, and the artistic remains show images of animals, like pigs and buffalo, as well as hand stencils and human figures. And these were all done in a reddish color. Now, the images are striking and they are very beautiful, in my opinion. And they're so clear that researchers can actually diagnose what species of animals are being shown here.
Mm.
Like, I think this large pig here is supposed to be a Visayan warty pig,
Right. Yeah.
the endangered species today.
Mm. Mm.
So very amazing, absolutely amazing. Um, okay, let's jump to the next slide now.
All right.
All right.
Uh,
So, many of our viewers will have heard about this. So, around 75,000 years ago or so, for the very last time, Mount Toba in Sumatra blew its top. This wasn't an ordinary volcanic eruption. However, this is a super volcano,
mm.
the largest of its type in the entire known history of hominin evolution. This event was enormous. Something like 2,800 square kilometers of magma were produced, blowing out a crater 100 kilometers by 30 kilometers wide, and spreading 4 million square kilometers of ash and dust across the world. Such a massive eruption devastated local communities and ecological zones, and it brought the global human population into a bottleneck of only around 10,000 individuals. So we were at once an endangered species.
Mm.
At least that was what was conventionally thought.
Mm.
So this Toba catastrophe hypothesis has had a very large presence in popular media regarding human evolution. You can see here, for example, Don Prothero's book on the
Mm.
bottom left, which came out a few years ago. Because it was put forward as an important event that influenced the peopling of Eurasia.
Mm.
This population bottleneck was supposed to be the catalyst that encouraged innovation during a 6-year volcanic winter
Right.
and
Right.
allowed our species to spread out into new lands following the eruption. It's also supposed to have influenced the global climate as a whole,
Mm.
uh,
Mm.
bringing the Earth into a 1,000-year cooling period. Well, recent research from those initial studies that were done all the way in the 90s have called a lot of this into question. Many studies have indicated that the worldwide effects of the Toba eruption were probably not as severe as once thought. This eruption did occur, of course, and at such a large size that it would have been something. It wouldn't have been something to shake a stick at.
Mm.
But as far as bringing the world into a 1,000-year cooling period, no.
Mm.
Uh, the core studies that have been done in various parts around the world have failed to find a correlation between the Toba eruption and a drop in temperatures.
Mm.
In fact, it seems that the climate was already undergoing a cooling period long before this eruption. And climate data from the core samples themselves don't really reveal a trace of the Toba eruption as well. There's no spikes or drops or anything that correlate with this time. Okay, then, what about the 6-year volcanic winter? Well, again, evidence is next to non-existent here. Sites as far as Eastern Africa have failed to find traces of it. And although there are small trace elements of ash in the core samples, they're not what we would find in a global volcanic winter.
Mm.
So okay, well maybe it was more severe on a local level. Not all that much, it seems. Indian records at most show perhaps a few local inconveniences. Maybe slightly cooler temperatures and a small shift in rainfall, but like no major ecological disruptions or extinctions.
Mm.
Even closer to the source in Sunda, the effects don't seem to have been as large. Some sites show a small loss of coniferous forests, but that's about it.
Mm.
again, no major animal extinctions or environmental shifts of great magnitude. Um, there have been a few genetic studies that have argued that some animal populations experienced population reductions at about this time, usually among big cats and certain great apes. Um, but again, it's unclear whether these correlate with the eruption
Mm.
or whether they're the result of other factors unrelated to this. Well, that just leaves us with the human impact, which, surprise, surprise, is little to non existent.
Mm.
The idea that the global human population underwent a bottleneck to 10,000 individuals was brought forth by early genetic studies, which suggested that this occurred at about the same time as the eruption 75,000
Mm.
years ago. Well, more recent work has revealed that the human population, which was already, keep in mind, relatively low, had undergone a period of gradual decline.
Mm.
This had started about 150,000 years ago and lasted until about 30,000 years ago. And the traces of that bottleneck was, in fact, the result of our expansion of such a small group of people into Eurasia during the main event
Mm.
60 to 50,000 years ago. So that proposed link was severed. Now, as far as the archaeological and genetic evidence shows, humans weren't reduced to an endangered species status due to the Toba eruption. Now, that's not to say that they wouldn't have felt any effects.
Right.
Goodness gracious, human history abounds with examples of disparate peoples facing problems due to a faraway volcanic eruption.
Mm-hmm.
But so far as we know, there were no major disruptions or severe impacts that decimated communities.
Right.
I mean, for our species as well as the Neanderthals and the other humans around at the time, the Toba eruption was probably a brief period of mild discomfort,
Mm.
but nothing so grand that it was killing like thousands and thousands of people.
Mm.
Albert, is there anything you'd like to add?
Not particularly, but this definitely is a subject that is often brought up in relation to human evolution, human origins, and uh, it's quite interesting because I haven't really followed the recent literature on this very closely. To hear that it's not considered to be nearly as impactful as it traditionally is.
Right, right, and this is especially true among anthropologists as
Mm.
well. Um, in fact, when that magnetic shift article came out that we
Oh
talked
yeah.
about, and people were bringing up in discussions and anthropological discussions like volcanic impacts. It's like, oh, wait till they hear about Toba. You know, it seems, at least from an anthropological and archaeological perspective, the Toba catastrophe hypothesis, based on the evidence that has been like observed, doesn't seem to hold any water.
Mm.
But I do understand there are like a couple researchers who still say that, like, well, this was still probably something that was pretty major,
Mm.
and the evidence that I'm looking at is showing that this was like a global catastrophe.
Right.
So, um, yeah, discourse, just heaps of discourse. So let's jump to the next slide now.
Yep.
All right, the land down under.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, Australia and its neighbors, Tasmania, New Guinea, and the Melanesian island chain, have traditionally been said to represent, yet another milestone in human history. Our species was supposed to be the only humans to have crossed Wallacea and reached this part of the world.
Mm.
But of course, newer discoveries have blurred this picture, as you might already guess.
Yep.
Flores Island lies east of Wallace's line, and Homo floresiensis made it there.
Mm-hmm.
And if these admixture studies have provided any clues, well, the Denisovans might have reached New Guinea and the surrounding islands as well.
Mm.
Um, but so far, according to the definitive evidence, only Homo sapiens managed to reach Australia.
Mm.
Now, much like Sunda, this part of the world was notably different during the Pleistocene. Lower sea levels exposed a lot of land and actually bridged Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea together as one continent called Sahul, after the Sahul Shelf under the northwest coast of Australia.
Mm.
From a biogeographical standpoint, Sahul represents another change in scenery for early humans that were entering the continent. A high endemic fauna of various marsupials,
Mm-hmm.
a whole host of parrots and songbirds.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the wonders of the Great Barrier Reef, Which would have looked different from today, but had an established presence here going back a couple million years. Environments stretched from the mountainous tropical forests of New Guinea to the semi-arid to arid plains of the Australian outback, and from the sparse fruit-bearing forests of the east, which were made famous by the Fern Gully movie, to Tasmania, which was actually very cool and partly covered by ice sheets, being so close to Antarctica that it was. Now, certainly, a generalist specialist like Homo sapiens would have a lot to work with coming here. Now, for years, the history of human DNA has pointed to a human settlement of Sahul by or around 50,000 years ago. Following that date, archaeological sites abound across the continent, going all the way south until they reach Tasmania by 40,000 years ago. However, a handful of sites have recently kind of thrown a wrench into the situation. And the headliner here is the Majibebe rock shelter in Western Arnhem Land in Australia, where a number of artifacts have been unearthed, including stone tools that were wrapped in yellow ochre, wood fragments from fires, and plant food remains that were charred by those same fires, among other things. These remains match what is known about other archaeological sites, as well as the varied cultures of living Aboriginal peoples. But when recent work on the site redated these remains, there was quite a surprise. Now, the result from this 2017 study by Chris Clarkson and colleagues showed that the Majibebe site was at most 65,000 years old. Not only was this much older than any previous Australian sites, but it was at odds with the genetic data.
Right.
It predated the main expansion out of Africa that living Aboriginal peoples were linked to. So, as you might guess, this site has proven extremely controversial. Some researchers have claimed, they've contested these claims by saying that the dating method was actually pretty flawed, or perhaps corrupted by other factors. For one thing, the 2017 study used thermoluminescence dating, not direct dating. That basically means that they measured how much time had passed since sunlight touched the remains. Because you remember, they were being found inside a rock shelter that had been closed up. For another, it's possible that the remains have been redeposited by natural factors. So, like a termite colony, making holes and causing the materials to kind of fall into lower layers,
Yeah.
making them appear older than they actually are. It's hard to say at the moment what the situation really is here. If the dating holds true, well, it might be that we're looking at an earlier Homo sapiens expansion than the ones seen in the genetic studies. Or maybe they represent a lineage from the main expansion that has left no descendants. Time will tell, of course. Now, subsequent population history has become much better known for Homo sapiens in Sahul. The most likely route, aka the least cost pathway, proposed for human settlement on the continent has been through the northern Wallacea Islands. So, crossing from Sahul to Sulawesi and on until reaching the western tip of New Guinea. And from there, some groups would have expanded southwards into Australia. And once there, and again going back to genetic studies, people spread very far and wide across the region very quickly. They reached the south between 49 and 45,000 years ago, and they most likely took routes along the western and eastern coastlines, given that the outback was still a new environment that people had yet to adapt to at the moment. Now, these studies have really gone hand in hand with traditional Aboriginal knowledge about their lands. Many of the First Nations have believed that they've always had a strong presence in their parts of the continent, and they've amassed such a close connection to the environment and its wildlife. And genetic studies have shown that many areas of Australia show the same continuity in human populations, and some of these go back 50,000 years. And this is further corroborated by observations and research that show that, for the most part, Aboriginal Australian and New Guinea communities have shared little contact with each other. suggesting that there weren't any population turnovers or great movements that followed this first settlement.
Mm.
Sometime between 40 and 25,000 years ago, the peoples of both regions had basically separated from each other,
Mm.
and they only engaged in very sparse contact after the fact. Now, of related interest is the settlement of the Solomon Islands, which archaeological remains suggests began by 43,000 years ago. Now, there's no reason to suggest that these southeastern expansions were not part of the same cultural repertoire that earlier settled Wallachia. So, people using bark canoes and bamboo rafts to journey between islands and relying on a great variety of marine resources.
Mm.
The distribution of sites along the islands reveals the limits of this type of oceanic culture. Like Wallachia, many of the islands were not more than 65 kilometers apart and well within viewing distance of each other. But once communities reached Makira Island, at the southernmost tip, they could go no further. Tens of thousands of years would pass before humans in Southeast Asia developed the outrigger canoe, and thus opened the greater Pacific Ocean for settlement. So let's jump to the next slide now.
Right.
Some brief comments on early Sahulian life are now
Mm.
in order. Early humans responded to the many diverse environments of this continent in their own diverse ways. Settlers in New Guinea were already clearing areas of forest 40,000 years ago to encourage the growth of certain plant species like yam and sugarcane. And Aboriginal peoples in Australia were living with and shaping their environment too. If the Majabebe rock shelter is anything to go by, we know that communities here had already begun to learn and utilize many of the native flora for their diets at very early dates. As you can see the images on the left, peoples were processing yams in much the same way that living peoples do.
Mm.
They peel the tubers and cook them over fires to get more nutrients. Other sites show areas where communities fished along paleo lakes, and they left behind middens that show diets of shellfish. And of course, they're the remains of game hunts. People hunted kangaroos and emus and other familiar animals.
Mm.
Of interest to paleo fans like us is Australia's megafauna,
Right.
which during the Pleistocene encompassed a number of strange beasts.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
I show three of them here at the right. There's Diprotodon, which was a relative of wombats and koalas
Mm.
that could weigh as much as 2,700 kilograms, which would have made it the largest known marsupial to have ever lived.
Mm-hmm.
And there were giant kangaroos and predators who probably hunted them. The so-called marsupial island Thylacoleo
Yep.
comes to mind. Now, on the reptilian side of things, there was a Varanus priscus,
Yep.
aka Megalania, which was this huge monitor lizard that, depending on some estimates, might have spanned over 7 meters long or so.
Yeah.
And there were giant birds as well.
Mm-hmm.
You may recall Guinea from Albert's series,
Yep. Mm.
a tall goose-like bird of the Dromornithidae.
That's right.
Yeah, which is of, if I remember, unclear affinities, but seems to be allied to the duck and chicken clade.
That's right. Yep. Mm.
Yeah, the Galloancerae.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
But yeah, the paleontological record of Australia has indicated that many of these large animals died out within a time frame of about 45 to 40,000 years ago.
Mm.
Although some do seem to have hung on for longer than that.
Yeah.
And this correlates very closely with the timing of the human population expansion across Australia,
Uh-huh.
which genetics indicates occurred between 49 and 45,000 years ago. So therefore, many researchers, including Tim Flannery of the 1994 book The Future Eaters,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
is a fun read, they have argued that Homo sapiens played a role in their extinction. Well, if you've been paying attention, you'll probably know that this is part of a much wider discourse
Right.
on megafaunal extinctions. And there's a fair share of scientists of multiple different fields who argue for different causes of the large animal's decline.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have time to get into that right now. I want to save that for the next episode.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, it all comes down to evidence. And at the moment, we don't have a whole lot that shows interactions between humans and the megafauna.
Mm.
Save for the Warachi rock shelter in southeastern Australia where there was the arm bone of a young diprotodon
Mm.
that was found alongside human artifacts. And there's possibly some depictions in early rock art in Arnhem Land. So, they certainly would have known about each other.
Mm.
At 50,000 years ago, these animals were still around for people to see. Um, the record is patchy, and more excavations need to be done before we can begin to build a good data set to work from.
Mm.
Of related interest is the discovery from environmental samples that Sahul began a period of aridification starting 50 to 40,000 years ago,
Mm. Mm.
adding a third point alongside the arrival of humans and the losses of megafauna. Uh, my own gut tells me that we're probably looking at a much more complex scenario than
Mm.
either hunting or climate change caused the extinctions.
Right.
Um, but again, we just don't have enough evidence. And so, yeah, again, I'll dig into this further on the next episode. Um, but before we move on, Albert, is there anything you would like to add?
Uh, no, not really. That seems like a pretty good summary, especially if we're gonna save the megafauna extinction for the next one. Yeah, that about covers all I would have wanted to say.
Okay, yeah. And I mean to save it because the vast majority of the megafaunal extinctions occurred towards the end of the Pleistocene.
Right.
So, like the kinds of time scales we're looking at right now, still too early for that
Mm-hmm.
to happen. So let's jump to the next slide now. Uh, we come back to Greater Eurasia
Mm-hmm.
and the lands that represent present-day China, Taiwan, North and South Korea, and Japan. And much like Southeast Asia, this part of the world has proven to be quite a complicated mess
Mm-hmm.
regarding early human occupations. Not only do we have evidence of an earlier occupation by Homo sapiens around 126,000 years ago, so preceding the main expansion, but there are a number of other human remains that were roughly contemporaneous with them,
Mm-hmm.
well known species like Denisovans, but many others that have defied classification. In the time before Homo sapiens became known in the region, East Asia was inhabited by a number of populations. And we talked about a few of these fossils in the Neanderthal episode. The Dali and Genution skulls of 260,000 years ago. It's unclear how long these populations lasted or what their affinities are. The last clear evidence of Homo erectus in East Asia is about 400,000 years ago. So if these remains do belong to that species, well, then that would bring their time range much closer to the present. Some researchers have speculated that these have something to do with the Denisovans.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, maybe they are Denisovans themselves. The Jahe mandible from the Tibetan Plateau implies that this species might have lived further east, and genetic studies further suggest this. So perhaps these skulls are the descendants of admixture between the two species. Well, here again, genetic evidence points to an interbreeding event over 300,000 years ago between the Denisovans and an unknown human species that diverged from the hominin lineage about 1.4 million to 900,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
One of those so-called super archaics. Well, given that members of the main expansion of Homo sapiens did interbreed with Denisovans, and likely somewhere in eastern Eurasia,
Mm-hmm.
well, then it demonstrates the complexities of human settlement here. Several researchers are beginning to think about the continuity with hybridization when talking about the peopling of East Asia. So this kind of harkens back to the old discourse about the multi-regionalism versus total replacement models.
Mm-hmm.
Our species was the latest in a series of humans that had started living here,
Right.
and by interbreeding with other humans, they incorporated their ancestry into the living peoples of today. This might explain the curious nature of the 11,500-year-old Maludong skulls that we also talked about previously. That initial 2015 paper describing those remains suggests that they're the result of interbreeding between Homo sapiens and another human species that managed to hang on until the beginning of the Holocene. So, how did our species get here? Well, as you might expect for a large region as Eurasia, there were a number of different environments and conditions that would have played a role in the settlement process.
Mm-hmm.
There's the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayan mountains, parts of which would have provided obvious barriers for movement in certain directions. In Central Asian regions, further to the northwest, like in present day Mongolia, many areas of the deserts and steppes would have probably proven too difficult for people at certain times. In southern China, the common ecosystem was tropical forest. In northern China, there was temperate forest, and these were cut across by the Huanghe, Yangtze, and Pearl rivers. And of course, keep in mind that these conditions would have altered between the last interglacial and glacial periods, changing the overall climate warm and wet or cool and
Mm.
dried, respectively. Now, much like the studies done in Southwest Asia, environmental data might provide some clues as to how our species and perhaps others like them entered East Asia. During the last interglacial period, in the time when we first find definitive evidence of our presence here, so 126 to 80,000 years ago, the southern Chinese tropical forests expanded, while the northern Chinese temperate zones expanded
Mm.
as the Central Asian deserts retreated. Uh, so there were more habitable conditions in the northern zone. So members of the earlier populations of sapiens would have found it easier to enter the region from the north. Well, movement from the south was not impossible, but a lot harder given the vast areas of tropical forest. Of course, that's assuming that these early Homo sapiens populations were more adapted to open environments than forested ones.
Mm.
It's not a 100% perfect model, um, and it's a little bit contested because the oldest Homo sapiens remains are from the south, not the north. Um, but it gives us something that researchers can look at.
Mm. Mm.
Alternatively, during the last glacial period, conditions were much cooler. The southern tropical forests of China gave way to more open woodland and grassland environments. And in the north, the Central Asian deserts actually expanded and dried in many places.
Mm.
So now we're dealing with the reverse situation. It would have been much easier for sapiens, in this case members of the main expansion, to travel into East Asia from the south,
Mm. Mm.
while routes through Central Asia were not impossible, but were very difficult. And not only that, but the lower sea levels exposed more land and likely attracted people to the coasts. The genetic trail for living Homo sapiens does closely align the peoples of East Asia to those further south, places like Sunda and India. So, in this latter case, there is support for a southerly route.
Mm.
So, let's go to the next slide now.
Yep. Mm.
This just shows a couple of these early Homo sapiens remains that have been found. It's mostly the presence of particular dental characters that have given these fossils their ID.
Mm. Mm.
Again, remember, our teeth are very diagnostic features. Um, but again, we face a similar question seen earlier. Are these humans linked with the earlier dispersals that occurred in the Mediterranean some 200 to 90,000 years ago? Did these humans interact in any way with later sapiens migrants? Was there admixture? We can't say for sure, but some researchers have already kind of held their stakes in the argument.
Mm. Mm.
There was one review paper from this month, incidentally, by Jean-Jacques Hublin, who strongly suggests that much of this evidence might be faulty or poorly dated, and that any evidence of sapient settlement in East Asia before 50,000 years ago is suspect. Similarly, a paper from February of this year by Darren Cugnot and colleagues, they performed dating on samples from the Fuyan cave site, and they found that these remains were less than 15,000 years old, so much younger than the 120 to 80,000 year date previously given. However, footnote, one of the anthropologists behind previous work from the site, Maria Martinon Torres, has actually come out and said that the samples behind that study are not the same teeth as shown here
Huh. Mm.
that made headlines a few years back, but they were a new sample that was excavated from the cave without supervision of the other researchers or with consultation from them. So, like the Cugnot et al. Paper is a little bit sketchy.
Mm. Mm.
But yeah, TLDR, there's a lot of work to be done before we can kind of fully understand the early Homo sapiens presence in East Asia, and what that meant in the grand scheme of things.
Mm-hmm.
So if we go to the next slide, looking at the later history of Pleistocene East Asia, well, we find our species doing what it does best, inhabiting a wide range of general environments and then specializing on the resources they're in. Like Australia and other regions of the world, there were megafauna here that the people could hunt. Cooler, temperate adapted animals like mammoths, horses, sheep, and gazelles lived in the north, and warmer tropical adapted animals like elephants, tapirs, rhinos, and panda bears lived in the south. Different habits of acquiring plant foods depended on where people inhabited. Those living in the north faced seasonal conditions that meant long periods where certain edible species weren't growing, while southern groups in the tropical forest regions had year round vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
In any case, if archaeological records are anything to go by, these people may do. Um, Tool technologies, interestingly, showed very little change between the Middle Stone Age and the later Stone Age, likely the result of cultural networks between different human species at the time. But by 30,000 years ago, these toolkits changed, and the characteristic microliths began appearing and showing up in a number of locations in the northeast, probably arriving from Siberia, before being diffused outwards across the region between 25 and 17,000 years ago. This was very likely the result of environmental changes. The last glacial maximum had occurred by this time, and human communities were probably engaging in cultural exchanges to help them survive these harsher years. Um, so that covers China's archaeological record. But what about the Korean Peninsula? Well, the later Stone Age started there fairly early, so people were in Korea by 40,000 years ago, at the same time that the earliest known evidence of Homo sapiens are found. Korea provides a neat segue into another area of discourse, because this may be a potential route that took people towards the settlement of the Japanese archipelago. So if we go to the next slide, yeah, if the map at the left didn't give it away already, there's actually no consensus on how the Japanese islands were first people. Uh, there's been all sorts of archaeological studies that put forth this route or that route, but it's all very inconclusive. Um, so you'd think that, okay, well, genetic studies might provide some help, but all they've done is complicate things too. Um, what we can be very clear about is that a significant portion of ancestry for the Japanese people today is of recent origin. It seems to have entered the area with the Yayoi agriculturalists from the Korean Peninsula by 300 BC, or perhaps earlier. Many thousands of years before that, the islands were inhabited by members of the Jomon culture, who established their cultural tradition roughly 14,500 years ago. Well, when we look at the ancient DNA of Jomon remains, as well as those of living indigenous groups that share some of that ancestry, like the Ainu, links have been found between northeast Siberian groups, like the Chukchi and the Ulch, groups in the Tibetan Plateau, forager populations in Southeast Asia, and with mainland East Asian groups. So it's unclear which of these were the ones that were involved with this first settlement. They might all be involved in some way, and perhaps not necessarily at the same time. Microlithic tools of the sort seen in northern China appear in the Japanese record about 25,000 years ago, and these have been proposed to be the result of diffusion. So maybe Japan was not settled once but multiple times. But whoever made it here first, they certainly would have needed watercraft for at least some parts of the journey. The earliest known remains in Japan include the 38,000-year-old site of Idimaruyama on Honshu Island, and even though sea levels had fallen dramatically, most of the islands were not connected to the mainland. When we look at the Ryukyu Island chain, human sites show that not long after, at 36,000 years ago, people were hanging out there. So whoever was settling on these islands seems to have been very good maritime travelers. And this is evidenced by the remains they've left behind, too. The people on the Ryukyu Islands, for example, not only ate shellfish, but they used the shells to make fish hooks and beads. See in the image here. So let's go to the next slide now.
Yep.
Uh, yeah, so the Tibetan Plateau gives another milestone
Mm-hmm.
for human settlement. This contains the tallest mountains in the world with an average elevation of 5,000 meters in oxygen poor air and temperatures that could reach close to the freezing point. So while it may have originally been a barrier to human movement, we did manage to make a living here too.
Mm-hmm.
So it was originally thought that the plateau was only settled rather recently, by agricultural groups from northern China during the Holocene. But recent archaeological work has shown that older groups made it here first by 40,000 years ago. While the region was harsh, it wasn't lifeless. Various mountain adapted plants grew up here. Animals like yak and gazelle and horse found
Mm-hmm.
good grazing grounds. So resources wouldn't have kept people away. And it seems, thanks to the discovery of the Jahe mandible, there were other human species here that might have helped us along the way. Examinations of Denisovan DNA in Tibetan populations have indicated uh, that there was admixture between the two species, and they provided resident Homo sapiens with a gene called EPAS1, which allowed the body to adapt to high altitude hypoxia.
Mm-hmm.
So, hence the reason why Tibetan peoples have managed to live so high for so long, while outside mountaineers need to bring oxygen tanks just to survive.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's incredible stuff. Uh, regarding East Asia, Albert, is there anything you'd like to add?
Not too much. I do remember hearing about the information about Denisovans providing that gene, and that was really interesting. And I had no idea that the the expansion into Japan was so murky in terms of what we know about it. That was definitely something.
Yeah, it's interesting when there's like no consensus because that means that we can expect more exciting studies
Totally,
in the
yeah.
near future. Yeah, like a lot of these papers, like you'll have researchers say like, oh well, we have this ancestry, and oh no, that ancestry is an artifact. There's not actually a link there. It's like, oh,
Mm,
actually, yes, there is because we have this sample sort, and it's a
right.
mess. It is a huge mess.
Wow.
So, um, uh, basically, people made it there at some point. We know
Yep.
that, before 38,000 years ago,
Right.
and it's just a matter of who and how many.
Right.
Um, so, all right, let's go to the next slide now. Moving along real good.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so, in what seems to be a trend in this series, we're now moving to an area of the world with we're moving from an area of the world with a fairly good early archaeological record to one where it's sorely lacking.
Mm,
That being Central Asia and the Siberian lands entering the Arctic Circle. Now, as far as our nearest relatives, the Neanderthals and Denisovans, are
mm-hmm.
concerned, the record is pretty okay. I mean, there's clearly been a prolonged presence of these species here, going back tens of thousands of years. In fact, the Denisova cave hails from this region, where we first learned about that new species. But for Homo sapiens, there's not a lot we can use. Some sites have actually not been dated properly yet, and the ones that have been, which start around 46.8 thousand years ago, contain no skeletal remains and only cultural objects and tools. In fact, the whole of the former Soviet states, from Kazakhstan to Turkmenistan to Kyrgyzstan, doesn't have anything that we can use. We have no idea when our species is supposed to have entered these lands. But at the very least, if we have sites in Russia at 46.8 thousand years ago and in Mongolia at 44.6 thousand years ago, well, then it's possible that Homo sapiens were living there in the
Mm-hmm.
former states at those times.
Right.
Now, Central Asia, much less the Arctic North, is a very formidable place. Before the domestication of the horse turned these lands into a highway of nomadic cultures, travel through this region would have been on foot and dependent on conditions.
Mm-hmm.
But during the last glacial period, it seems, curiously enough, that certain parts of the land were actually warmer and wetter, and they supported various paleo lakes.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been studies that have been done that show that least cost pathways for humans wanting to, that were expanding into Central Asia, they could have been using these greener corridors. and bypassing some of the drier deserts and steppes initially,
Mm-hmm.
where there would have been less resources. Now, to deal with these cooler conditions, humans in Central Asia seem to have been among the very first that we know about to develop the sewing needle. Remains from both Siberia and northern China show bone needles at sites between 45 and 40,000 years ago. By taking the skins and furs of native animals, sheep, deer, big cats, people could make more insulated clothes and shoes and provide more protection than they otherwise would have had. And these innovations allowed them to reach the Arctic Circle.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Central Asia, that's a tough environment, but northern Siberia was even more extreme, especially during the last glacial period. The entire area would have been mostly treeless tundra, supporting a very hardy caste of animals like the woolly mammoth,
Mm-hmm.
or the woolly rhinoceros. And these were difficult, but they were rewarding hunting grounds. And evidence suggests that people took to them fairly early. So at the 36,000-year-old site of Mamontovaya in Russia are the remains of a mammoth tusk, hence the site's name, the Mammoth Curve in
Mm-hmm.
Russian. And this is associated with human artifacts, including stone tools that were likely used to hunt the animal that owned this tusk. And similarly, the Yana site, also in Russia, has hailed additional evidence of mammoth hunts, as well as the remains of rhinos, bison, and reindeer kills. Between 29 and 27,000 years ago, people returned to the Yana site time and again to hunt for game, and they left behind a whole host of aesthetic ornaments and tools, but no evidence of living structures. So, what was probably going on was that this was the site that hunters prepared for in advance and traveled to as part of a temporary hunting expedition. Once prey animals are collected, they could return with them to their homes further to the south and provide for their communities. And so it was that our species, hitting another milestone, managed to survive and adapt to Arctic conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So let's jump to the next slide.
Yep.
I'd like to highlight a fascinating culture that has come into recent understandings of human prehistory, the ancient North Eurasians. These people and their culture do not exist in the present day, but their ancestry can be found among populations as far flung as Western Europe and North America.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because these people, who we've since learned were around in Siberia at least 24 to 15,000 years ago, contributed to the human history of both of those regions. At some point around 25,000 years ago, so again, hinting at earlier occupations than what we know about, ancient North Eurasians admixed with the Northeast Siberian communities that would eventually populate the Americas. And at the opposite end of their range, ancient North Eurasians admixed not only with early European foragers, but also with the ancestors of the Yamnaya culture,
Mm-hmm.
who eventually began their spread into Europe roughly 5,000 years ago, introducing the Indo European languages to the peninsula. So if you're a European or Native American or Siberian, you very likely have some ancient North Eurasian ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the discovery of the ancient North Eurasians benefited from the DNA sequencing of the remains from the multiregional culture, which were determined to have belonged to the original ancient North Eurasian population and were located west of Lake Baikal, where those famous freshwater seals live.
Mm-hmm. Right.
As you can see from the remains here, including human burials, these peoples created a lot of materials out of bone and antler. It's not like wood was available much. Uh, there were stone tools among the Maltabire people, but there were also ivory points too. All very easy to store and carry along. The evidence seems strong that these sites, with evidence of skin-covered animal bone dwellings, were temporary camping areas that were set up during the winter months, which explains why all of these tools and aesthetic objects, like these bird pendants here on the left,
Mm-hmm.
that's numbers 7 and 8, as well as these really lovely anthropomorphic structures
Mm-hmm.
on the right, are small enough to be portable. The latter here are very richly detailed, as you can see, and the features carved into these bone sculptures have provided clues to some researchers about how the Maltabire people dressed themselves. Being a tundra community, they would have worn very thick clothing, and not only do we find those on the figures, but we can even tell that they were patterned and decorated with jewelry.
Wow.
Yeah, quite a nifty window into the past. Um, and it has been suggested that we have the ancient North Eurasians to thank for one gift to the world stage, the one I think that we're all the better for. So if we go to the next slide,
Yep. Mm.
hey, who doesn't love dogs? Famously known as man's best friend. Of course, men don't get to have all the fun. Dogs are for everybody. Um, so the dog, officially Canis lupus familiaris, was the earliest domestic animal in association with human beings. Of course, it's been argued that the dog's ancestor was self-domesticated, which we went into detail in the previous episode. But I don't want to get too deep into the nitty-gritty of that right now. What I want to focus on for just a moment is the domestication of the dog in context, and then what followed. You may recall from our February news show that I talked a little bit about the history of dogs in reference to the Angela Perry et al. Study. Well, it turns out that after I read more of the literature on this subject, it's a lot more complicated than I thought. Um, so, if you like, you can consider this slide an update to that news coverage. While we can be fairly confident that the domestic dog descended from the gray wolf, so Canis lupus, it turns out that the dog's ancestors aren't found among the living populations of gray wolves today. Instead, all of these groups descended from a now extinct common ancestor that seems to have lived somewhere in Eurasia during the late Pleistocene. At some point before 23,000 years ago, the human wolf connection formed, and again, perhaps with the ancient North Eurasians, and it seems that domestication, or self domestication, happened relatively quickly. Now, curiously, around 25,000 years ago, the other wolf population suffered a heavy genetic bottleneck. And one group that had clung on in the extreme northeast of Siberia would eventually go forth and repopulate much of the former gray wolf range by 15,000 years ago. Following domestication, dogs usually, not always, followed their human caretakers, and they spread far across the world, forming at least 5 major lineages, which I show here in this phylogeny.
Mhm.
All the dogs that lived with Amerindian and Inuit communities prior to the Columbian Exchange descend from 3 separate entries into the continents by 2 lineages. The ones that also first populated the Americas with human beings. Dogs also eventually traveled to Oceania and populated Australia, New Guinea, and the Pacific Islands. Although all of this was at a much later date, around 7,000 years ago in the Holocene. And dogs traveled into Africa too, again, later on, before 7,000 years ago. As far as the general shape of the dog family tree goes, we know that they group into about 5 major lineages that correspond roughly to geography, but their complicated history post domestication has made it difficult to tell exactly how they branched off from each other. Some studies say that the dingo and the New Guinea singing dog lineage split off first, and others say that it's allied to the East Asian dogs. Well, some say that the dogs of the Americas and the high Arctic form their own lineage, but others say that it's also allied to the East Asian dogs. And then some point to a clear West-East Eurasian dichotomy between all of these groups. And others say, no, that's not the case. What we can be sure of is that dogs interbred with each other a lot in the past. And not only that, they also interbred with gray wolves multiple times. And this all probably explains why it's been so hard to figure out this phylogeny. But in any case, dogs are here to stay, and we are all the more grateful to them. Albert, is there anything you would like to add?
Not particularly.
Alrighty. And I guess if you haven't figured out already, these are my sister's dogs. I'm sure she was tickled pink that I asked, hey, can I get a cute photo? It was hard to choose. There's so many great photos of these two.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so this is them going to the dog park. Alrighty, let's go to the next slide now.
All right.
Europe represents a region of the world that paleoanthropologists know quite well. After all, this is really where the field began and where the first known human fossils have been found, and where a great majority of archaeological work has been done. As such, a lot of conceptions about human prehistory have been unfortunately skewed
Mm.
by this richly documented record, because in a lot of literature, as well as popular media, the European late Stone Age has been overemphasized
Mm.
in relation to the rest of the world.
Right.
We know so much about this period of time at the expense that research had historically been few or even ignored over the rest of Eurasia and Africa and the Americas. Um, you'll often read in older books about the Cro-Magnons who lived in Europe. Well, that name comes from the site of Cro-Magnon
Mm.
rock shelter in France, where the 27.6 thousand year old remains of early European Homo sapiens were first unearthed in 1868. Now, at first, the term was restricted to these remains, and then expanded a little bit into its more usual designation for the whole of Europe. But later on than that, its use was widened to include the whole of our species during the Pleistocene. In fact, people went as far as to give Pleistocene Homo sapiens a subspecies name, Homo sapiens fossilis, which you can still see in some older books today.
Mm.
Um, but nowadays, you'll still occasionally hear this word used, but many researchers have chosen to think about early European modern humans, or European early modern humans, or some variation on that. They don't really use the word Cro-Magnon in a technical context.
Mm.
So Europe encompasses the lands from the Iberian Peninsula to the Ural Mountains, and from Scandinavia to the Balkans. So it's hardly a continent in any geological sense. Following a very early population expansion here, around 210,000 years ago, Homo sapiens made its first permanent presence by 50,000 years ago, following the main expansion from Southwest Asia. The two regions remain closely linked together across the human story, again, with very evidence suggesting that cultural movements between them occurred at very early dates. And among the evidence here, we find various peoples in present day Romania, Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic utilizing the Bohunician toolkit between 48 and 40,000 years ago. And I highlighted it here in blue on the map. In a similar case, with the Southwest Asian Emiran toolkit, which was contemporaneous and probably ancestral to this one,
Mm.
these tools heavily incorporated level wall techniques to make flakes and blades. It's important to note that these peoples also coexisted with Neanderthals for a time. Well, 50,000 years ago, when the climate in Europe was fairly warm, the Southwest Asian ancestors of the Bohunicians seem to have taken advantage of the good times and expanded their range northward into new territory. But it appears that a brief snap of cooling conditions in the area around 40,000 years ago disrupted life here. And it's because of that, most likely, that the Bohunician toolkit vanished from the fossil record at about the same time.
Mm.
Now, as all this was going on, other human communities from Southeast Asia began to spread very quickly along the Mediterranean coasts. They reached Iberia by 41,000 years ago. Their toolkit was likely derived from the Amarian, and it did not use level law techniques. It would be these people and their descendants who established the firm foothold in Europe for the remainder of the Ice Age. So let's jump to the next slide now.
Yep.
So we come to the first cultural complex in Europe, the Aurignacian, which is named after the town of Aurignac in France, where road workers doing construction in 1858 began to find human remains inside a nearby cave. Several years would pass as archaeologists explored the caves and revealed more finds, including stone tools. The Aurignacian toolkit and its associated cultures have been unearthed across a vast swath of Europe, as you can see from the map below. For a brief period from 37 to 35,000 years ago, some Aurignacians seem to have moved back into the Levant as well, only to fade away after their Amarian neighbors persisted.
Mm.
These stone tools consist of stone scrapers, burins, and blades, which these people could then use to manipulate organic materials and produce a wide range of technologies, which you can see kind of in the graph on the right here. For one thing, the bone needle first appeared in Europe, associated with the Aurignacians, which would give them and their descendants the clothing necessary to penetrate further north as the climate cooled. We also find antler points, which could have been whittled with the stone burins to the desired shape and then attached onto spears. Now, the atlatl, or the spear thrower, as well as the bow and arrow, seem to have been much later inventions on the European stage. It's hard to say how early these technologies showed up in Europe, but they don't appear definitively until about 17,000 years ago or so. Now, the Auric nations seem to have been long distance travelers, with groups moving hundreds of kilometers across terrain to specific rocky outcrops to fetch the desired materials for their stone tools. Several researchers have examined Auric nation sites across Europe, taking note of the similarities and distinctions between certain objects. Some areas contain specific types of marine shell, ivory, and bone beads for body decoration, and these can be quite different from area to area. Now, there are places where stone tool shapes have been standardized as well. It has been proposed then that the Auric nations, and perhaps some other peoples across the Pleistocene world, engaged in much larger scales of social organization than is seen in the typical nomadic forager groups. Demographic studies suggest that populations steadily increased in Europe as the Auric nation cultures lived. Single communities in Western and Central Europe might have supported on average over 150 people, and were generally dispersed from each other by a few hundred kilometers each. While these sorts of fission fusion relationships common in nomadic forager groups might still have been possible, evidence points to increasing regionalization,
Hmm.
where communities certainly engaged goods and peoples with each other, but they thought of themselves as belonging to more self governing societies than an overall forager band. Such societies, as seen in the ethnographic literature, tend to have much more social organization than nomadic foragers. Both may recognize kinship groups, but in contrast to the latter, where leadership roles were situational and based on experience, the former may utilize the leadership of organizations or councils in overall decision making.
Hmm.
Uh, and this is tied very closely to a shared responsibility as a group. Now, keep in mind that these are not the same as kings or chiefs or presidents. Leadership was still shared among individuals, it was just on a larger scale. And these larger scale communities could certainly organize hunts on larger scales too.
Hmm.
We have evidence of mammoth and other megafaunal kill sites that are known for Aurignation remains, likely groups of hunters who systematically drove the animals into pits or deep river banks and then repeatedly speared them to death.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, traditionally, anthropologists use the word tribe to describe these types of societies. But that word has such a convoluted and troubled history that
Hmm.
nowadays it isn't commonly used. At most, you'll probably see it with some cultural anthropologists in the context of a cultural evolution
Hmm.
framework,
Hmm.
but they represent a little bit of a minority. So let's go to the next slide now.
Yeah.
The Auric nations, like other Pleistocene peoples, were masters of aesthetics.
Hmm. Hmm.
From these cultures, we find a number of famous finds: animal and human figures carved in mammoth ivory, suggestive engravings on rock walls, and one of my personal favorites, the lion person of Lohenmensch
Hmm.
uh, from Germany, which has a humanoid body but a lion's head. And this was also carved from a mammoth tusk. But we have no context for why this figurine was made.
Hmm.
Maybe it's somebody's prehistoric fursona.
You're right.
I don't know. Um, now, it's the figurative art of European caves that have really captured the imagination. The depictions of Ice Age animals at Chauvet Cave in France are some of the earliest made by peoples in Europe. They are dated 37 to 28,000 years old, and the clear suggestion of movement among prides of lions or herds of horses is just breathtaking. I mean, the suggestions of shading, as well as what appears to be the deliberate attention to details like animal coat patterns, really sets these apart. And a lot of the beauty here at Chauvet Cave was documented in a 2010 film by Werner Herzog, The Cave of Forgotten Dreams. Um, I joke, of course, but if y'all haven't seen it yet, please do so. Um, Unfortunately, I don't really have time to go into the details of Paleolithic cave art and all the various hypotheses as to why they were made.
Hmm.
Um, that'll have to be for another time. Um, but Albert, do you have anything to add?
I don't think so.
Alrighty then. Let's jump to the next slide now.
All right.
So, by 33,000 years ago, a new cultural complex emerged on the European stage,
Hmm.
the Gravettian. Now, these peoples owe their name to the La Gravette rock shelter from France, the site where the toolkit was first recognized in 1880. This seems to have been a cultural descendant of the Aurignacian toolkit,
Hmm.
which genetic studies on associated remains suggests emerged in Eastern Europe and then diffused westward, in part by migrating peoples.
Hmm.
It didn't completely replace the Aurignacian in Europe, however, and the two cultures actually coexisted for many thousands of years. The Gravettian toolkit stands out in that their stone tools were prismatic.
Hmm.
That is, they were prism like in shape, especially the blades. And their points were blunted on the ends to make it a little bit easier to haft onto spears. Burins were mostly used, as they had been for the Aurignacians, to work with organic remains like wood and bone, as well as to prepare skins and furs. The Gravettians seem to have been capable hunters, and they followed the same trends as their ancestors had by living in ever larger communities. In Western and Central Europe, the total population of Aurignacians at any one time might have been roughly 1,500 people in total, but the Gravettian populations encompassed roughly 2,800 people. Now, the presence in several localities, including caves, as well as open air sites of food storage, is a dead giveaway that these communities were likely semi sedentary.
Hmm.
We find that people were digging pits into permafrost and storing animal bones and flesh there, like a refrigerator.
Hmm.
And archaeologists have also found millstones for grinding seeds and grains. Now, the fact that the Gravettians had sewing needles lends support to the possibility that, along with making clothing, cloth containers or maybe even baskets for keeping these grasses weren't out of the realm of possibility. Now, the open air sites include some very durable dwellings made from mammoth bones, the restoration of which can be seen in the photo below. The level of time and organization needed to construct such shelters, including the hunting and retrieval of mammoth parts, and the observation that these communities were essentially forming villages of multiple bone dwellings, lends further support to this cultural hypothesis. Sedentary societies, even semi sedentary ones, have social divisions as a rule, and there would have been leaders present within these large communities to divide labor amongst them, designating individuals who worked on dwelling construction or food acquisition or food storage and security of said storage.
Hmm.
In an environment like Europe, where the climate was growing ever more cooler as the last glacial maximum approached, all of this needed to be planned in advance and organized carefully, lest the community face some very harsh times. Let's go to the next slide.
Yep.
The site of Sungir in
Hmm.
western Russia offers a very fascinating look into Gravettian life. Dated 32 to 28,500 years ago, a person between 35 and 45 years old was buried here, decked out in a robe that was sewn with over 2,900 beads made from mammoth ivory. Their body was covered in red ochre. They were wearing a hat that was fitted with about 12 fox teeth, the canines.
Hmm.
Their arms above their elbows were fitted with 25 ivory bands, and sitting above their chest was a stone pendant that was painted. And all of this was preserved around their body due to the nature of the burial. The flesh and clothes had rotted away, but the ivory beads had basically been kept in place,
Hmm.
and leaving the outlines of how all this jewelry was worn. This didn't appear to have been an ordinary burial, however. Skull evidence suggests that this person was actually stabbed in the neck, just enough to sever the nerve cord and the backbone.
Ooh.
And it's possible that the sharpened flake sitting between the burial's legs, which you might be able to see, was the tool that did it.
Hmm.
We have no context as for why the individual was stabbed and buried in such fine attire,
Hmm.
much more elaborate than anything we've seen in Stone Age European populations.
Hmm.
But right alongside them are the burials of two equally dressed children that were between 10 and 12 when they died, arranged so that the tops of their heads were touching. But in their case, we don't know how they died. Some researchers have speculated that these burials are associated with social competition between two communities, a side effect of semi sedentary existence, and that this adult had actually been killed in a war,
Mm.
after which their community honored them with a ceremony by which their immediate family, in this case their two kids, were ritually killed and buried alongside them.
Hmm.
This is a thing that has been documented in a number of historical societies. But others point to less conflicting causes. Supernatural obligations might have meant that this figure, who was perhaps a spiritual leader, was ritually sacrificed by their will. And while there is some evidence to suggest that the children's burials occurred at a separate time than the adult, DNA analysis does show that the three individuals were closely related.
Hmm.
So, however they died, it's very clear that the semi sedentary social structure of the Gravettians permitted the presence of individuals with such apparently high status. I mean, my goodness, the amount of time it would have taken to craft so many thousands of ivory beads,
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
which has been calculated to be at least 10,000 hours of work, means that large numbers of people worked to support them and their families, perhaps at the expense of their own lives.
Hmm.
But it's hard to say. If we jump to the next slide,
Hmm.
um, we've already touched in brief the domestication story of the dog. It seems that the Gravettians were the first Europeans to acquire these animals from the East. There have been a few remains between 36 and 26,000 years ago that have been proposed to be domestic dogs, which would predate the 23,000-year-old mark or so. Um, However, once their ancient DNA was recovered, it was found that they actually weren't related to the common ancestor of living domestic dogs.
Hmm.
The fact that these remains are associated with humans, maybe this is a possible failed domestication attempt. It's a good question. What importance to note is that the later remains from 24 to 20,000 years ago do fall within the domestic dog lineage, according to their DNA studies, suggesting that it was about that time the domestic dog spread into Europe from the east. Now, one aspect of Grubettian life that is always fascinating to me is, of course, aesthetic materials. Like the Orignacians, the Gravettians are known for some very lovely and curious artworks, but most famous of all have to be the so-called Venus figurines,
Hmm.
which are these stone and ivory sculptures of bodies that often exaggerated sexual features.
Hmm.
Now, while the Gravettians developed most of these figures, they have been found in other archaeological contexts, so like among the earlier Orignacians, as well as the multiregional peoples of Siberia. It's unclear whether these are all related to each other or not. Now, in many cases, their detail is very exquisite, and like the multiregional people, you can make out different types of clothing and hairstyles on some of them. Um, Another one of my favorite Pleistocene artworks is the figure at the top right,
Hmm.
the Venus of Brassempois from France. It's only about 3.6 centimeters high, um, but you don't get a lot of figures with faces on them, and when you do, it's almost kind of a kind of an otherworldly feeling.
Hmm.
Like who was this person?
Right.
What stories could they tell? Are they even real? Is this sort of a platonic ideal of a Gravettian made by somebody else? Is it a self-portrait? Who knows? Um, we know next to nothing about the reasoning behind the Venus figures. Given their extensive range across thousands of years, some research suggests that many of them are unrelated to each other. All the usual speculations have been talked about multiple times in the literature. These are ritual objects, or they're fertility symbols, or they're representations of ancestors, or maybe spiritual figures, or what have you. But there have been a number of novel hypotheses too.
Hmm.
There was one by researcher Leroy McDermott in the 1990s that suggested that most of the Venus figurines were self portraits. So, like, when you look at your body down to your feet, the proportions of your chest, belly, and legs can match what is seen on a Venus figurine like this. This has been criticized to some extent, however, because I mean, there's really nothing to suggest that these people's like didn't know about mirrors. You know, you can look at yourself in like a pool of water and see
Hmm.
yourself just fine. It's not like you wouldn't know what you look like all the time.
Right.
Um, there is another researcher, Dale Guthrie, in the early 2000s, who just straight up argued that these are all porn drawn by rather horny people living in a frustrating time. Hence the reason why all the breasts and the vulvae are given so much attention, while the heads and arms and legs are given so little attention. I guess there were no foot fetishists in the Ice Age. But yeah, like those are just two of the many different ideas for the Venus figurines. And it's a really great mystery. I seldom think that we're gonna figure out anytime soon. So let's move on now.
Right.
One more stop on Europe before we continue. I just want to highlight two known cultures that were present during the harshest periods of the last glacial maximum. So by 26,000 years ago, the Aurignacian culture was gone, followed very closely by the Gravettians around 21,000 years ago. And this corresponds to the higher points of the LGM, when the northern ice sheets really extended further south. Now, I had talked early on in this episode about range shifts and how human populations can expand or contract like a pump depending on environmental conditions. Well, that explains Europe's situation during the LGM. Your communities were pushed further south into warmer ranges because the north just turned way too severe for people to live in. And the archaeological trail demonstrates this perfectly. Parts of the UK, Germany, and Poland were actually depopulated between 28 and 18,000 years ago when people show up again in those places. The descendants of the Gravettians and the Aurignacians who migrated south changed their cultures, in some cases a little bit dramatically. But like the sorts of semi-sedentary societies and growing populations seen in earlier times all but vanished during the LGM. Most of the people seem to have resorted back to more nomadic tendencies. In the west, particularly around the Iberian Peninsula, lived the Solutreans, who emerged around 22,000 years ago. They remain a relatively unknown culture in the archaeological community. Their main claim to fame being their characteristic flat stone spearheads, which you can see here, which were heat treated over hearths and then pressure flaked with an antler point to kind of get that shape. These stone points have been associated with a few reindeer kill sites, including that of Solutré in France, in which this culture got their name after the discovery in 1866. But beyond that, we have very little to go off of, which incidentally didn't stop the filmmakers behind the 2018 film Alpha, which based it on the Aurignacian cultures. Yeah, that movie is okay. It's one of the better Ice Age movies out there, but I still feel that it has some problems.
Right.
The wolf dog they use is at least very cute. So to the east, we find a continuation of the Gravettian emerging 21,000 years ago, the Epigravettian. I mention this out of the sake of completeness, because even though you'll see this name in the literature, some researchers prefer to think of it as a later stage of the Gravettian. I mean, really, the differences between the former and the latter toolkits are minimal. The use of stone, bone, and antler didn't change, and it just kind of adapted with the times. Many of the more charismatic Ice Age megafauna, like mammoths and rhinos and reindeer, they don't really appear at all at much of the Epigravettian sites. Instead, more commonly, we find roe deer, horse, ibex, beavers. The biggest game that you usually see are like bison, moose, and red deer, the European elk. And people were fishing for catfish and plaice and sturgeon. They were carving fish hooks out of bone, one of which you can see here. And beyond the presence of similar bone and ivory jewelry at some sites, there doesn't seem to be the case that the Epigravettians inherited the large semi-sedentary societies of their ancestors. Europe would have to wait till the end of the last glacial maximum before those types of cultures returned. I guess, Albert, regarding Europe, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Not that I can think of.
Alrighty then. Let's continue now. We're in the home stretch.
Right.
So now we move back eastward to Siberia and the lands known as Beringia, after the Bering Strait that separates Eurasia from North America. Of course, famously, during the last glacial period, these regions were connected, thanks to fallen sea levels. So this area of the world represents one of the final stages of the peopling of the world. by Homo sapiens. Beringia is often described as a land bridge, but that's not really a good name for it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in terms of total land area, this place is comparable in size to mainland Europe.
Right.
And as we've learned in our coverage of Central Asia, during the last glacial period, humans had adapted themselves to Arctic conditions through the use of the bone needle for sewing warm clothing. Clearly, they were getting more and more used to taiga and tundra conditions because we find sites in eastern Siberia that date to 44.6 thousand years ago, where people were hunting mammoths and fending off a couple hungry wolves.
Hmm.
By 32,000 years ago, there's a greater and greater presence of communities here, and before long, peoples had made it to Beringia, crossing into present day Alaska before 25,000 years ago. It's at this time that the last glacial maximum kicked in, and many sites in the extreme north of Siberia were depopulated, as it happened in Europe. Genetic studies indicate that humans might have found themselves trapped in a standstill in Beringia for a time, although this is debated. Um, by 25 to 22,000 years ago, genetics reveals, these populations of northeast Siberia split in two, separated by the cooling conditions. Those who stayed to the east are known as the ancient Beringians, and they are the direct ancestors of the peoples of the Americas. So if we go to the next slide,
Yep.
um, one such ancient Beringian site that has provided a lot of fascinating information is Upward Sun River in Alaska,
Hmm.
dated 13.2 to 11.5 thousand years ago. Besides the DNA evidence that I mentioned earlier, we have found some important cultural remains associated with these rather unfortunate infants that had to be buried after dying at the
Hmm.
ages of 4 and 7 months, respectively. Um, Buried alongside these children were stone flakes and hafted points, as well as several spears that were made from antler.
Hmm.
And these tools provide evidence of clear similarities between both Siberian toolkits and North American ones. And coupled with the genetic evidence points to obvious links between these two regions. Now, the ancient Beringians were isolated from much of the world for quite a long time, surviving in nomadic bands that occupied temporary camps where conditions were just favorable enough to acquire the resources they needed. In fact, in some places, they were able to fish for salmon. And over time, as conditions bettered for them, they more likely headed south towards the Aleutian Islands. If they headed further east, they would have been blocked by the two great ice sheets,
Hmm.
the Cordilleran and the Laurentide. So there was no way to expand into the Americas during the last glacial maximum by land. But what about by sea? Well, if we go to the next slide, uh, according to the knowledge provided by genetic studies, the ancestors of the indigenous American peoples seem to have diverged from the ancient Beringian populations by 21,000 years ago, and only started settling the continent after 17,500 years ago or so. Many researchers suspect that in order to bypass the ice sheets, communities would have had to construct watercrafts and boats
Hmm.
and move across the exposed islands of the eastern Pacific Ocean. Once they reached the greater landmass, they were free to expand across the continent, either on foot or by continuing southward by boat.
Hmm.
However, there has been a growing number of evidence that the Americas were settled long before 17,500 years ago by peoples who managed to establish a foothold prior to the last glacial maximum, perhaps as much as 30,000 years ago. Now, this is very contentious archaeological territory.
Hmm. Hmm.
A very easy way to start an argument is to get a bunch of prehistorians in the room and ask, when were the Americas people? The biggest discourse concerns the evidence itself. A lot of these sites have big histories behind them, and the artifacts uncovered are not associated with any human remains. Just last year, for example, at a Chicohuite cave in Mexico, researchers uncovered around 1900 stone tool artifacts that were then dated to between 26.5 and 19,000 years ago. This cave seems to have been occupied for a while because there is evidence that the people who stayed here for a couple few millennia just kind of barely changed the structure of their tools over that time span. So you can see evidence of like cultural shifts occurring. Now, the researchers of that study made absolutely sure to date the remains and the cave multiple times, like 50 times they did dating studies,
Hmm.
and they used both radiocarbon and thermoluminescence dating. And so for them, the timing seems to check out. But in order for people to have lived here so long ago, well, that would mean they needed to establish a presence in the north at least before the last glacial maximum, perhaps as much as 33,000 years ago. Um, 5 other sites further north in Piauí in Brazil show human have a habitation at a similar time, between 30 and 20,000 years ago. Again, no human remains, but there are stone tools in the dozens, and the authors of this study, again, are very confident in the reliability of their dating. Well, other archaeologists have cast doubt on the remains because A, they don't seem to match up with what is known from ancient and living DNA studies, and B, the lack of human remains suggests that perhaps these artifacts might be the result of natural processes. You know, stones that look like tools, or maybe tools from younger layers that have fallen into older deposits. Some of these sites show evidence of hearths, or maybe they're wildfires. Then there's the infamous case of the Trudy Mastodon site from California that
Right.
some of you might have heard about. Supposedly a 139,000-year-old kill site that came with stone tools that were unlike anything seen in the archaeological history of the Americas. So all kinds of speculation abounded. But in the end, for that particular case, it might just be that neighborhood construction tampered with the site. They damaged some of the bones and then deposited some broken stones around a mastodon that had died a natural death.
Right.
So yeah, like these scholars have tended to, or rather, conventional scholars have tended to dismiss American sites before a certain age, and they are very confident that the conventional model best explains the evidence more than anything else. Well, according to some researchers, however, it's not so much the problems of evidence that have caused so much doubt, but maybe it's due to some sort of colonialist or maybe racist assumptions about indigenous American peoples. Saying that they just couldn't have arrived here at such an early date. A big name in this discourse is an anthropologist, Paulette Steeves, who is Cree-Métis. She has been working on this topic for over a decade now, and she's convinced that not only were the Americas populated early on, but that high-ranking archaeologists have been actively dismissing and preventing minority, including indigenous scholars, from adding new findings. In July of this year, her first book is supposed to come out. I show it here. This is the Indigenous Paleolithic of the Western Hemisphere. And we'll be sure to link it for pre-order in the description. And this is supposed to showcase her work and findings. I'm very curious to see what this book has to say and what kinds of studies she's looking at. Apparently, Paulette Steeves has highlighted evidence of even earlier occupations than 30,000 years ago. She's talking about 60 or even 100,000 years ago of humans in the Americas. I'm certainly not very familiar with those studies, so I'm certainly hooked to see what she has to say. But like regarding all of this, it's important to recognize that conventional knowledge changes in anthropology all the time. Of relevance to this episode is the fact that once upon a time, many archaeologists were convinced of the Clovis first hypothesis. Right. That makers of the Clovis toolkit were the founders of the continents, and they arrived here 13,000 years ago and expanded rapidly both through the north and south. But we now know that these people belong to a much later cultural complex, and that pre-Clovis societies were present as far back as 16,000 years ago. And now this has become the conventional knowledge. I don't have the answers to this question, but I do think it's very likely that a lot, or perhaps most of this earlier evidence going back 30,000 years or so, might end up being substantiated in the end. There's absolutely nothing that says that humans absolutely couldn't have arrived in the Americas at such an early date. I mean, I've just explained how Wallacea and Sahul were populated by seafaring peoples around 50,000 years ago.
Right.
And how the Japanese archipelago was reached by boating communities 38,000 years ago. So, why couldn't Pleistocene peoples have just kind of taken their boating knowledge with them and skirted across the North Pacific to reach the Americas by those dates? And you know what? Who's to say that only Homo sapiens entered North America?
Mm.
Maybe the Denisovans or another species cross over at one point. Um, this will certainly be a very fascinating uh, discourse to see,
Mm.
and where this conversation is going to go in the next couple of years.
Mm.
Um, Albert, do you have anything to add?
Not much except to say that I was definitely looking forward to your coverage of this topic because I know how contentious it is, and that's a great overview. And definitely, I remember when I started college, for example, and was learning some of the stuff from courses I took then. Definitely, it was the Clovis first hypothesis was considered very much a conventional kind of mainstream thinking, but just a couple of years after that, that felt like to me when this new kind of model started really taking over, and I actually became a teaching assistant for one of the courses that I took when I was a freshman, and um, later on when I was in my junior year, and by then the kind of the syllabus had to change to say that yeah, now we do have some evidence for an even earlier kind of peopling of the Americas. That incidentally was Dr. Holtz's kind of a class on kind of um, major topics in paleontology and kind of how we know what we know, that he teaches to and anyone who is interested in that subject. So yeah, I've kind of seen this discourse evolve just within my relatively kind of short academic career.
Oh yeah, and of course likewise as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
You read older books and you see like older news studies, these dates just keep getting older and older. And
right.
like now that I'm older and I recognize, well, for one thing, discourse in the sciences.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny. Like growing up, like you first initially learn like, oh, okay, like scientist A finds this, and then scientist B finds this, and upends the previous person's findings, and therefore that's how science progresses, in its knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's not what happens at all.
Right.
In many cases, it's scientist A says, no, no, I have good evidence for this, and your evidence is actually a little bit flawed,
Mm-hmm.
and then person B will say likewise, and then everybody has a stake in this fight, and it's so contentious. And so yeah, like this is certainly one of those,
Right.
um and that yeah, I'm very curious where this is going to go in the next few years. Like watch like tomorrow, we finish recording this and some news story is going to come out
Right.
that's, well, we got some good stuff from 40,000 years. I'm like, oh well, okay. Just missed it.
Right. Right.
um, well, alrighty then, let's keep going to the next slide. And in keeping with the convention for now,
Mm-hmm.
so we have an origin of Amerindian peoples around 21,000 years ago. Their population splitting off from the ancient Beringians and following a peopling of the continents commencing after 17,500 years ago. Well, much like the last episode regarding the Kalahari Bushmen, there doesn't seem to be a consensus view on what is the best term to use for the indigenous peoples of the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
In my work, I've used the word Amerindian,
Mm-hmm.
which has an anthropological history of usage, and curiously is the preferred term for Caribbean scholars.
Hmm.
However, other words have been coined. So, of course, you got American Indian and Native American, First Nations, Aborigine, etc., 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 with varying levels of popularity.
Hmm.
Um, of course, all of this goes back to Cristoforo Colombo. So Columbus, when he landed in the Bahamas in 1492, he was convinced he landed in the Indies, which was the name given by Europeans to the general area of Eastern and Southeast Asia. So therefore, when he encountered the Taino nations there, he called them Indians,
Hmm.
and that name has been with us ever since. So now you might think, well, okay, nobody uses Indian anymore. We should be using better words like Native American, or more sensibly, we should ask indigenous peoples themselves what word they use. In the latter case, that's very good advice. Um, but it turns out that things are more complicated on this discourse.
Hmm.
Charles Mann, in his wonderful book 1491, talks about this. He mentions an interview he did with an indigenous student from Bolivia. At one point, he referred to her as a Native American, to which she kind of shook her head and was
Hmm.
like, Well, we're Indians here. Native Americans live only in the United States.
Hmm.
So, there are indigenous peoples on both continents who prefer Native American and others who prefer Indian.
Hmm.
It all just kind of depends on the person, it seems. Um, from a historical perspective, this is all a little bit silly. I mean, indigenous communities in the pre-Columbian Americas didn't think of themselves as one people.
Hmm.
Just like Europeans hadn't before the late medieval times.
Right.
Terms like Indian or Native American or Amerindian are outsider words that are used to define otherwise disparate and diverse peoples. They're very simplifying. Um, so it really should only be appropriate in certain contexts, like how I'm using it here to discuss founding populations, to use like over encompassing words.
Hmm.
Um, but like whenever you're dealing with like specific nations, it's always best to use the names that the peoples call themselves.
Right.
So that's my take on this whole thing. Anyway, so there are a number of different pre-Clovis sites across North America between 16 and a half and 13,000 years ago. My mentioning of a Pacific coastal route to the continent is relevant here because prior to 13,000 years ago, there really wasn't a great way to enter North America except by the sea.
Hmm.
So, following the end of the last glacial maximum 15,000 years ago, both the western Cordilleran and eastern Laurentide ice sheets were beginning to melt down the middle. But this ice free corridor wasn't really a biologically viable place for human beings until 13.1 thousand years ago. So we see steppe conditions and associated flora and fauna 12,600 years ago, open woodland 11,500 years ago, and finally boreal forest 10,000 years ago. And it's not until 13,000 years ago that we find evidence of human occupation within the ice-free corridor.
Hmm.
So while some researchers suggest that moving into the corridor was from a south to north route, so of course peoples that were here earlier than 13,000 years ago traveled up the
Hmm.
ice-free corridor as it was melting, it cannot be outright rejected that some Amerindian groups that were living in Alaska might have ventured north to south once it became easier to do so.
Hmm.
The genetics suggests that since this is all the same founding population, either a coastal route or an inland corridor route can't be like favored one way or the other.
Hmm.
So maybe it happened at the same time, which seems to be the most likely case. Now, regarding the Pacific coastal route, it's been observed that the um, eastern Pacific coasts are some of the richest ecosystems in the ocean.
Hmm.
They harbor large communities of mollusks and fish and whales and seabirds. Of course, not to mention the great kelp forests that are
Hmm.
just lovely to look at. So people traveling from the shores of Beringia and down south to the exposed lands would have crossed these islands and would have been the presence of really great fishing grounds, more than enough food to sustain themselves as they were expanding into North America. So this has led researchers to propose the kelp highway hypothesis. But the biggest flaw regarding this is that, well, any early sites we'd expect to find of boating peoples 16,000 years ago uh, are now stuck deep underwater.
Hmm. Right.
Since the Earth sea levels have risen since the last ice age. Maybe we'll be lucky and find some sites,
Yeah.
but again, it's just like Sunda. It would be difficult to do so.
Hmm.
Once on the continent, according to the genetic studies, Amerindian communities appear to have diverged into at least two populations around 15,700 years ago. One which settled in the high north and termed rather creatively as the northern North Americans,
Hmm.
and one which traveled further south and entered South America. Again, equally creatively, the southern North Americans. Now, whatever the demographic history revealed by this, it's very clear that by 15 to 14,000 years ago, there was a widespread human presence in the Americas. So let's go to the next slide now.
Yep. Mm.
Um, what were these pre-Clovis or Paleo-Indian, if you like? Again, another term to throw into the basket.
Mhm.
What were peoples like here in early North America? Well, given what we know about the biogeography of the region, the continent sported a wide range of environments 16 to 13,000 years ago. There were the central Great Plains, the broadleaf forests of the southeast, the mixed woodlands of the southwest, and due to the ice sheets, lots of tundra, taiga, and conifer forests
Mm-hmm.
across the north. We find human sites in all of these places. So regional adaptation, even in the apparent absence of other human species to help them, like Denisovans, was fairly quick for the time intervals concerned. Now, early Amerindians were expert hunters and likely members of nomadic foraging communities based on the very portable nature of their toolkits. They were going after many different prey animals, including much of the megafauna present at the time. The Pleistocene North America was a very different place from today.
Mm-hmm.
It looked more like the Serengeti National Park than the Yellowstone National Park in terms of the wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
We had horses and camels and tapirs and ground sloths and giant armadillos called glyptodonts.
Mm-hmm.
You had lions and saber tooths and the mammoths and the mastodons, of course, which you can compare their anatomies here at the bottom right. Um, a number of sites show evidence of kill sites for these larger animals, the elephant lineage groups. At Manus in Washington State, hunters killed a mastodon 13,800 years ago. Researchers were able to find a bone projectile point that was still embedded in the animal's rib cage. So that's direct evidence of hunting. At Page Lutzen in Florida, there was another mastodon site that was heavily butchered by stone tools 14.7 to 14,500 years ago. And at two sites in the Northeast, Hebor and Schaefer, they document mammoth kills. So sites like this provide fairly good evidence that human beings were interacting with the native megafauna. So more so than we find in, say, the Australian archaeological record. And this has implications for the eventual extinction of many of these animals, which again is a story for another time. So let's jump to the next slide now.
Mm-hmm.
We reach the last of the continents to be peopled, South America. But if the evidence is anything to go by, humans established a presence here not very long after they had arrived in North America.
Mm-hmm.
This again may be due to the presence and utilization of a kelp highway that encouraged communities to disperse along the Pacific coast and continue until they reached the tip of Tierra del Fuego by 10,500 years ago, where the people here would actually eventually be isolated by the formation of the Magellan Strait 7,500 years ago. Now, South American archaeology has been a very piecemeal organization. Many regions remain closed to excavation due to the landscape. Deep jungles in the Amazon basin, for example, are not the best archaeological sites. But slowly a picture is emerging of the deep history of this place, including Amazonia. Much like the North, humans in South America adapted themselves to a variety of environments. The Andean Mountains in the west, the Pampa of Argentina and southern Brazil, and of course the Amazon rainforest. Curiously, during the last glacial maximum, this rainforest was much more fragmented and intermediately vegetated than it is today.
Mm-hmm.
The latter history of that region is probably be unexpected to a lot of our viewers. It's a story for another time.
Mm-hmm.
Genetics has suggested that human population history was much more complicated here than previously thought. Over the following 1,000 years after first settlement, groups actually seem to have moved between Central America, and there's evidence of a major population turnover beginning around 9,000 years ago, which contributed much of the ancestry of present-day Amerindian nations. This in turn was followed by a long-term regional continuity, especially in places like Argentina and southern Brazil. Confusion has also emerged regarding a so-called population Y, which some of you might have heard about, which was detected in some indigenous Tupi-speaking Brazilian peoples. The genes associated with this population Y are shared with Aboriginal Australians, Papuans of New Guinea, and the Andamanese peoples, as well as the Taiwan remains from China. So that's interesting. And population Y wasn't found anywhere else in the Americas. So at first, discussion loomed about the source of this ancestry. Some of the more unlikely suggestions were of a very early trans-Pacific crossing to South America from Australia.
Right.
But as we've just discussed, the technology was probably not there for that sort of voyage, and there's no evidence for that anyway. Um, it was soon proposed that this population Y might have belonged to the original source communities that peopled the Americas from Beringia.
Mm.
So, like this founding population was much more genetically diverse than what is usually now seen in the indigenous Americas. Um, and there's a small possibility that the signal for population Y is a fluke
Mm.
that was created by an error in DNA translation.
Mm. Mm.
But more work needs to be done before we can be sure about that.
Right.
So let's go to the next slide now.
All right.
Um, Many sites in South America have provided great evidence for several different life ways beyond big game hunting, which did occur here as well.
Mm.
The site of Quebrada Jagué on the coast of Peru has provided the remains of maritime resource acquisition around 13,000 years ago. The people here were collecting shellfish like clams and crustaceans, and the presence of anchovies and drums at the sites implies the use of net casting along with the usual fishing with lines to catch their food. Of interest is that obsidian was also found at Quebrada Jagué, um, but these rocks don't occur naturally here. Researchers have traced their origin to the neighboring Andes, so we have some possible evidence of perhaps contact between two different communities, a coastal one and a mountainous one. Much like North America, there seems to have been a clear association between the Amerindians and the local megafauna. The composition of South America's large animals was fairly similar to the North. They had ground sloths and glyptodonts and horses, camels, and elephants, and elephant relatives like the gomphothere. And there were even curiosities left over from older times. The native ungulates Toxodon
Mm.
and Macrauchenia were some of the last surviving members of a lineage that spanned almost 60 million years in South America,
Mm.
but has since left no living descendants. We find several pre-Clovis kill sites, like Arroyo Seco 2 in Argentina and Taima Taima in Venezuela, where humans killed and butchered megafauna. The later Venezuelan site even contains, again, a mastodon pelvis with a stone point still inside it, direct evidence of hunting. But the most fascinating evidence of human megafaunal interactions, as far as we know,
Mm.
made headline news late last year. If we go to the next slide,
Yep. Mm.
many of you,
Yeah.
I hope, will remember our November 2020 news show,
Mm. Mm.
where I talked about the rock art of Serrania La Lindosa
Mm.
in Colombia. So it's not very necessary to go into all of those details again, but I just want to re-emphasize that this site contains some of the oldest known rock art in South America. It's between 12,600 and 11,800 years old. And during this time, the continent was still supporting megafauna. And if the interpretations by the researchers of this figurative art are correct, many of these depictions are of extinct animals, like ground sloths and horses and mastodons. Um, additional eyewitness proof of an environmental relationship between early Amerindians and a world of lost giants,
Mm.
if you will.
Mm.
I don't have too much to add about this. How about you, Albert?
I don't think so. Not that we haven't already gone over.
Right, right. Alrighty, with that, we finally reached the end of our journey.
Yeah.
So the car is finally parked. Let's jump to the next slide real quick, just to recap. The peopling of the world by Homo sapiens was, in my opinion at least, one of the most dramatic population expansions in the last few million years.
Mm.
Maybe even in geologic time, if we want to go that route.
Mm.
By creating and occupying a generalist specialist niche, humans could traverse across biogeographical regions and widely diverse biomes and manage, for the most part, to establish a long-term presence. From our origins in Africa around 350,000 years ago or earlier, to our explorations of the Mediterranean 210 to 86,000 years ago, to the main expansion into Eurasia 60 to 50,000 years ago that supplied Australia, Melanesia, Europe, East Asia, North and South America with culturally complex and highly adaptable human communities.
Mm.
Over the span of just a couple thousand years,
Yeah.
we were already very widespread, having interbred with a number of other human species, only to demographically replace them all. We we would still have a long way to go before the rest of the Earth's surface was inhabited by humans. Um, and only Antarctica was really spared from our journeys,
Mm-hmm.
um, at least until very recently.
Right.
But the people who would settle this frozen landmass were not big game hunters or maritime fishermen or collectors of wild grains, but international teams of scientists studying the most dramatic landscape in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the fact that only about 10 people have actually been born in Antarctica leaves little room for speculation that we'll ever establish a really permanent home on such a cold place. But, as we've just learned from our Pleistocene adventures, stranger things have happened.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Albert, do you have any closing remarks?
So how about New Zealand and the other Pacific islands?
Well, those will have to come at a much later time,
Right.
because for our narrative purposes, we come to a close at about the end of the last glacial maximum.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, for that context, if we go to the next slide,
Right.
in our next episode, we will continue the human story and follow what happened at the end of the last ice age. Our present world, within a particularly nice interglacial period,
Mm-hmm.
is called the Holocene epoch, and it began 11,700 years ago. We're going to explore how human communities around the world adapted to this new world of warming conditions and rising sea levels, and how they spread to other parts of the world, including eventually the Pacific Islands,
Mm-hmm.
and more. The formation of more and more sedentary societies around this time kickstarted changes in cultural evolution that have led to effects felt even today. So, from the extinction of the megafauna to the development of pottery to the intricacies of early religion and politics and
Mm-hmm.
science, we're going to talk about all of that and more next time.
Exciting.
And with that, we reach the end of our episode. Finally,
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to acknowledge, of course, our good friends Henry and Alicia for their contributions to
Mm-hmm.
this series.
Yep. Mm.
And you are more than welcome to follow us on Twitter for updates. We are at Time and Clades. And of course, you're likely watching this episode on our YouTube page through Time and Clades. We encourage you to subscribe. If you have any questions for the show, please feel free to drop some comments, perhaps maybe more helpful comments. And or you can email us at timeandclades@gmail.com. And of course, in our description, we post our links for references for this episode. Of course, again, as is usual for this series, there's quite a lot here
Mm-hmm.
to go through. It's a big journey, it's a complex journey, but it's been a heck of a lot of fun researching all of it and learning some new things along the way.
I can tell.
And with that, for the next week, we're going to take a break.
Yep. Mm.
We've both been busy, and I've been doing a lot of work on this show, and my brain needs a rest. I set my alarm clock for 8 this morning, and I stopped it, and it closed my eyes for a second, and opened it up, and it was 9:30, and I was like, "Damn, I'm tired."
Yeah,
But
you deserve a rest.
yeah, but rest assured, we will be back. In fact, for that following week, that will be our March news episode,
That's
won't
right.
it?
Yep. Mm.
At which point, then we will continue on with Albert's wonderful series, looking at birds of prey.
Mm. That's right.
Definitely looking forward to that. But then, until next time, we'll see you all very soon.
That's right. Mm.
Awesome. Take care, everyone.
Have a good one.